New York had been lively for the past few days as the Stark Expo drew people from all over the world. But Luke and Selena lived very peacefully. Foggy had already set up the renovation company, and Luke had invested in it. Now, the old hands and a dozen or so temp workers had already started to receive information from Little Snail. They ran through the streets and alleys of Manhattan to pull in business. Bent Bennett, a former employee of the Department of Defense, was now a special researcher at the New Hope Research Center in Nassau County. He worked at his own pace, the budget was his alone and he didn't have to wrangle with anybody. Luke had chosen the name New Hope after much consideration. It was the New Hope from his previous life. Luke hoped that the technology in this lab would be like the livestock raised on a farm. They went in small and skinny, and came out plump and fair. Then there was Mindy, who got along with Monica and Nikki like a house on fire. Monica lived in Harlem. The three girls actually didn't live far from each other, and getting around wasn't troublesome. Usually, the three of them would go to Nikki's house to fight, and Nikki would then drive them home. Now that she had new friends, Mindy didn't have time to visit Gold Nugget recently. It was only at 9 that night that Luke left with Selena and Gold Nugget. "Are you sure it's an important base for the hand?" Selena asked behind him. Luke knew that she just found it boring to crawl through the sewers, so he said casually, "I caught two ninjas in red on camera going in and out, and carrying things. Given the hand's temperament, there's no way they're moving bricks." Selena asked, "What do you think is inside?" Luke said, "According to Little Snail's calculations, it's probably people." Selena found that odd. "I don't think the hand is involved in human trafficking, right? At least, our files don't show that." Luke said, "That's right. That's why I'm curious about who they're bringing inside." As they chatted, they climbed out of the sewers. In a small alley, the armor's smell removal system was activated, and mist rose up in the darkness. Then, it was silent once more. The two people and one dog headed straight for their destination, an old building by the river in Manhattan. The three of them didn't linger outside. Luke entered from the front while Selena and Gold Nugget blocked the back door. The moment they entered, they felt that something was wrong. It was too quiet here, and the place didn't look like it was occupied. Except for signs in the hallways, it was clear that there wasn't any other movement in the place, which was covered in dust. For a stronghold, this was very unusual. A moment later, Luke reached the 6th floor at the top. He entered a room and frowned. In the room, more than 10 kids were locked in metal cages with tubes attached to them. The tubes weren't injecting any liquid into the kids. Instead, the tubes were extracting their blood, which was collected in glass jars before the blood was poured into what looked like a cross between a stone coffin and a big bottle. Luke's face darkened. This wasn't anything good. The lenses quickly confirmed the identities of 2 or 3 kids. They didn't have any criminal records, but were ordinary civilians with proper profiles. More and more kids were identified, and it was the same for more than half of them. Luke snorted coldly and his hand brushed against his waist before his arms suddenly swung out. 2 bat darts spun and silently disappeared into the darkness. 2 ninjas in red fell from high corners and hit the ground hard. Luke cancelled his stealth mode in the darkness outside the door. His black cape dropped down and his eyes glowed red. He had come in the Batman suit today with no intention of killing anyone, but this scene infuriated him. Batman didn't kill people, but these ninjas weren't human. After they fell, there was still no system notification. Luke walked over and picked up the 2 bodies. The armor's detection function was activated, and the data generated was very abnormal. Grimly, he tore open the shirt of one ninja, only to see a distinct Y cut on the man's chest. Luke immediately tore open the other ninja's shirt and found another Y-shaped cut on his chest. Narrowing his eyes, he stood up and stored the 2 bodies in Space 1. System: kill 2 of the hand's resurrected ninjas. Mission accomplished. Total experience, 3,000. Total credit, 3,000. Contribution rate, 100%. EXP plus 3,000. Credit plus 3,000. Luke sneered. Interesting. The only things that could be stored in Space One were dead things, like dead people or dead animals and bugs. There was no notification that the two ninjas had been killed, which meant that they weren't dead. However, their bodies could be stored in Space One. Only after the bodies were put away did the system send out the kill notification. The sequence was reversed. Coupled with the resurrected ninjas in the system notification, a lot of information had come to light. However, Luke didn't want to dwell on it for the time being. There were still over 10 children who were being drained of blood. Rescuing people was what Batman should do. Luke returned with a first aid kit. Tearing off the latches on the cages, he took out the 4 tubes from the kids, stopped the bleeding, and bandaged the wounds. The armor's detection function never stopped reporting the kids' physical conditions. Their lives weren't in danger for now, but who knew if it would stay that way? A warning came through from Selina. Something's wrong. I called the police, and their cars are on their way, but people from the Hand are here too. Looking at the group of ninjas in red approaching from the dark alley, Luke sneered. It's fine. You and Hellhound don't move. Leave them to me. As he spoke, he walked out of the room and stood in the hallway outside. He didn't activate the stealth function and simply stood there quietly. Suddenly, there was the sound of rushing wind on the right side of the hallway, and a dozen shurikens spun out of the darkness. Luke swiped at his waist, and a series of bat darts were sent out like a swarm of bats. Clinks ran out in the air as the shurikens were deflected by the bat darts, which then flew at strange angles and disappeared down both sides of the hallway. There was a series of dull thuds, followed by the sound of heavy objects falling to the ground. There were no screams. It was quiet once more on the right side of the hallway. Luke looked to the right, as if he could see through the darkness. The next moment, he disappeared into thin air. It was as if a strong wind had swept through the hallway, kicking up dust to cover the right side. New York had been lively for the past few days as the Stark Expo drew people from all over the world. But Luke and Selina lived very peacefully. Foggy had already set up the renovation company, and Luke had invested in it. Now, the old hands and a dozen or so temp workers had already started to receive information from Little Snail. They ran through the streets and alleys of Manhattan to pull in business. Bent Bennett, a former employee of the Department of Defense, was now a special researcher at the New Hope Research Center in Nassau County. He worked at his own pace, the budget was his alone and he didn't have to wrangle with anybody. Luke had chosen the name New Hope after much consideration. It was the New Hope from his previous life. Luke hoped that the technology in this lab would be like the livestock raised on a farm. They went in small and skinny, and came out plump and fair. Then there was Mindy, who got along with Monica and Nikki like a house on fire. Monica lived in Harlem. The 3 girls actually didn't live far from each other, and getting around wasn't troublesome. Usually, the 3 of them would go to Nikki's house to fight, and Nikki would then drive them home. Now that she had new friends, Mindy didn't have time to visit Gold Nugget recently. It was only at 9 that night that Luke left with Selina and Gold Nugget. Are you sure it's an important base for the Hand? Selina asked behind him. Luke knew that she just found it boring to crawl through the sewers, so he said casually, I caught 2 ninjas in red on camera going in and out, and carrying things. Given the Hand's temperament, there's no way they're moving bricks. Selina asked, what do you think is inside? Luke said, according to Little Snail's calculations, it's probably people. Selina found that odd. I don't think the Hand is involved in human trafficking, right? At least, our files don't show that. Luke said, that's right. That's why I'm curious about who they're bringing inside. As they chatted, they climbed out of the sewers. In a small alley, the armor's smell removal system was activated, and mist rose up in the darkness. Then, it was silent once more. The two people and one dog headed straight for their destination, an old building by the river in Manhattan. The three of them didn't linger outside. Luke entered from the front while Selena and Gold Nugget blocked the back door. The moment they entered, they felt that something was wrong. It was too quiet here, and the place didn't look like it was occupied. Except for signs in the hallways, it was clear that there wasn't any other movement in the place, which was covered in dust. For a stronghold, this was very unusual. A moment later, Luke reached the 6th floor at the top. He entered a room and frowned. In the room, more than 10 kids were locked in metal cages with tubes attached to them. The tubes weren't injecting any liquid into the kids. Instead, the tubes were extracting their blood, which was collected in glass jars before the blood was poured into what looked like a cross between a stone coffin and a big bottle. Luke's face darkened. This wasn't anything good. The lenses quickly confirmed the identities of 2 or 3 kids. They didn't have any criminal records, but were ordinary civilians with proper profiles. More and more kids were identified, and it was the same for more than half of them. Luke snorted coldly and his hand brushed against his waist before his arms suddenly swung out. 2 bat darts spun and silently disappeared into the darkness. 2 ninjas in red fell from high corners and hit the ground hard. Luke cancelled his stealth mode in the darkness outside the door. His black cape dropped down and his eyes glowed red. He had come in the Batman suit today with no intention of killing anyone, but this scene infuriated him. Batman didn't kill people, but these ninjas weren't human. After they fell, there was still no system notification. Luke walked over and picked up the 2 bodies. The armor's detection function was activated, and the data generated was very abnormal. Grimly, he tore open the shirt of one ninja, only to see a distinct Y cut on the man's chest. Luke immediately tore open the other ninja's shirt and found another Y-shaped cut on his chest. Narrowing his eyes, he stood up and stored the 2 bodies in Space 1. System: kill 2 of the Hand's resurrected ninjas. Mission accomplished. Total experience, 3,000. Total credit, 3,000. Contribution rate, 100%. EXP plus 3,000. Credit plus 3,000. Luke sneered. Interesting. The only things that could be stored in Space 1 were dead things, like dead people or dead animals and bugs. There was no notification that the 2 ninjas had been killed, which meant that they weren't dead. However, their bodies could be stored in Space 1. Only after the bodies were put away did the system send out the kill notification. The sequence was reversed. Coupled with the resurrected ninjas in the system notification, a lot of information had come to light. However, Luke didn't want to dwell on it for the time being. There were still over 10 children who were being drained of blood. Rescuing people was what Batman should do. Luke returned with a first aid kit. Tearing off the latches on the cages, he took out the 4 tubes from the kids, stopped the bleeding, and bandaged the wounds. The armor's detection function never stopped reporting the kids' physical conditions. Their lives weren't in danger for now, but who knew if it would stay that way? A warning came through from Selena. Something's wrong. I called the police, and their cars are on their way, but people from the Hand are here too. Looking at the group of ninjas in red approaching from the dark alley, Luke sneered. It's fine. You and Hellhound don't move. Leave them to me. As he spoke, he walked out of the room and stood in the hallway outside. He didn't activate the stealth function and simply stood there quietly. Suddenly, there was the sound of rushing wind on the right side of the hallway, and a dozen shurikens spun out of the darkness. Luke swiped at his waist, and a series of bat darts were sent out like a swarm of bats. Clinks ran out in the air as the shurikens were deflected by the bat darts, which then flew at strange angles and disappeared down both sides of the hallway. There was a series of dull thuds, followed by the sound of heavy objects falling to the ground. There were no screams. It was quiet once more on the right side of the hallway. Luke looked to the right, as if he could see through the darkness. The next moment, he disappeared into thin air. It was as if a strong wind had swept through the hallway, kicking up dust to cover the right side. At the very front of the hallway, a ninja in red was crouched in a corner. Suddenly, he felt a weight on his back, and with a crack, intense pain radiated from his chest. He wanted to get up, but realized that he no longer had the strength. Luke simply stepped on his back, leaving behind a huge footprint. The second ninja, who was holding onto the ceiling light, just saw his partner being stepped on, when it went black in front of his eyes. Luke, who had crushed the first ninja with one foot, leapt up, and his iron-like leg lashed out. The ninja's chest caved in to match his partner's back, and he was sent flying. Using the force from the kick, Luke adjusted his posture and kicked off of the wall. The waist of a third ninja who brushed past him was crushed. The ninja was sent flying 10 meters before he hit the ground and rolled several times. At that moment, Luke had charged out of the hallway and into a spacious hall. The ninjas here finally reacted, and 2 gleaming katanas swung out. The cape on Luke's back suddenly hardened, stopping his fall. With a hard twist, he kicked out with his legs. Clang! Clang! With 2 crisp sounds, the 2 katanas were broken, and the 2 ninjas were kicked in the face. Their faces instantly collapsed. Luke landed lightly and stared at a black figure not far away. Although there was barely any light here, he could still see the man's face. The man was spinning a chain with a hook on the end, as if he was ready to attack at any moment. Luke recognized that face. Not long after he arrived in New York, he had killed this guy called Yashitake Shin to save Matt. At that time, the guy had 7 or 8 ninjas in red with him. He had also been wearing a red ninja outfit and holding a chain sickle. Now, Shin was dressed in black, and the weapon in his hand had turned into a hook on a chain. Batman. Yashitake gritted his teeth and said the name in a low voice. All this time, he had thought that this #1 superhero was far away in Los Angeles and that his strength wasn't worth mentioning. Even if there had been buzz about Batman's appearance in New York in the last 2 days, he didn't think he would run into him so soon. But now, Batman was standing in front of him and had killed more than 10 of his men in an instant. Luke slowly raised his right hand and pointed at Yashitake Shin. His deep voice echoed in the building. You, guilty. Yashitake Shin's heart trembled slightly. It never ended well for bad guys pointed at by Batman. Everybody knew that this meant that Batman wouldn't let the person go. He had seen the video of Batman beating up 2 vampires outside the hospital in Los Angeles. Batman wasn't a benevolent person. He didn't kill people, but that wasn't necessarily the case for certain things that weren't human. For example, himself. But Yashitake Shin didn't panic, because he had nothing to fear. With a shout, the hook chain in his hand flew at Batman like a scorpion's tail. Luke didn't dodge at all as he charged at the man. It was very strange that this guy whom he had killed once could come back to life, but his abilities hadn't improved, and he was still so weak. Luke simply raised his right hand and gave a light flick with his fingers, and the hook that had been aimed at his neck was deflected. Yashitake Shin didn't stop there. He pulled on the chain and it wrapped around Luke's ankle. Luke's foot instantly flashed as he kicked the hook just as it reached his ankle, and it flew back to bite its owner. Alarmed, Yashitake Shin ducked. But the hook abruptly made a wide arc and took a sharp turn in the air. Poochie. Yashitake Shin fell to his knees with a thump, the same disbelief on his face as when Luke pierced his head with a knife last time. The hook had already pierced his chest from under his right armpit, and he couldn't breathe. Who knew if he was wondering how Batman was able to kill him so efficiently, or if he was wondering why he was even weaker. Luke simply stood in front of him and said coldly, "You're guilty. You deserve to die." The light in Yashitake Shin's eyes gradually dimmed, and his lips moved, but he couldn't finish his sentence. Luke didn't want to hear it. God made a mistake letting this person live once more. It was only right that he died with his eyes open and unfinished words. When Yashitake Shin fell to the ground, Luke put the man's body into Space One. System: kill Yashitake Shin, an important leader of the Hand Assassin Group. Mission accomplished. Total experience, 5,000. Total credit, 5,000. Contribution rate, 100%. EXP plus 5,000. Credit plus 5,000. Luke was pleased. He had deliberately let this guy be resurrected last time, but he really wanted to kill him this time. He walked back and forth in the hallway, killed all the other ninjas and collected their bodies. In this group, Yashitake Shin and the two ninjas in red who had been killed at the beginning were the strongest. Clearly, the Hand couldn't perform resurrection so casually. Naturally, these people couldn't be resurrected now. With the system's death proclamation, there was practically no chance of them coming back to life. Hearing the approaching sirens, Luke turned invisible again. He secretly put the stone coffin that looked like a big bottle into Space One. System: life-type magic tool has been detected. Can be converted into 10,000 credit points or modify the inventory's functions. Convert/modify. Luke just looked at it. Naturally, he didn't choose to modify it now. Although he didn't know what other functions the modification would bring, he felt that this trip had been worth it. For this alone, he was determined to kill all of them in the future. In addition, killing 17 ninjas in red, including Yashitake Shin, and saving the dozen or so kids, earned him a total of 24,000 experience and credit points. None of these ninjas were worth less than 1,000 experience and credit points. That meant that every ninja had done more bad things than 50 innocent people. Luke knew why the experience and credit points were so high. For example, most of the hitmen of the high table whom he had killed only went after targets who were worth generous rewards. Unless it was to protect themselves, their every move had to be economical. As long as they weren't crazy, professional hitmen wouldn't kill ordinary people without any reward. If they did a lot of this, they would lose worth as hitmen. The Hand was actually one of the 12 members of the high table. But it was an evil existence that felt no mercy for ordinary people. Even Kingpin couldn't compare with it in terms of how vile it was. At the very least, Kingpin still regarded ordinary people as potential clients and preserved basic social order, thus preserving his business. Thus, although he didn't have any sympathy for ordinary people, he wouldn't kill them casually. He had killed more gangsters in comparison, when annexing all the gangs in America. But the Hand wasn't like that. If it wasn't for Luke and Matt cleaning up the gangs in Clinton, the Hand absolutely wouldn't have been so good as to use a real estate company to relocate residents. Perhaps the last few to move out might never be seen again. Anyone who got in the way of the Hand was assassinated without fanfare. That was how the Hand did things. The Hand ninjas were also different from the other hitmen of the high table. These ninjas didn't need reputation or money, they were just the Hand's weapons, tools for getting rid of obstacles. As long as the Hand gave the order, they didn't mind slaughtering civilians and getting innocent blood on their hands. So, the Hand couldn't stay, and the ninjas couldn't either. While Luke was pondering this, the patrol cars arrived, and teams of patrol officers charged in. Luke watched them take the kids to the ambulances before he went to the roof. Before he reached the roof, he cancelled his invisibility and let his tall and black figure appear at the top of the building. Watching the police cars drive off, he looked at another building not far away, where two dark red figures faced him. The blood-red lenses on his visor flickered, and he jumped. His cape unfurled as he followed the ambulances. After 100 meters, blue light flashed, and the man disappeared in the night sky. The woman who had been staring intently gasped. "Batman?" He disappeared. Matt's heart jumped, and he was silent. Invisibility couldn't erase the sound of the bat suit slicing through the air, so Matt knew that Batman had just concealed himself. But he didn't want to say anything to the woman next to him. He trusted Batman more than this woman. She was none other than Matt's ex-girlfriend, a woman named Elektra. Luke had revealed himself to them earlier so that Matt wouldn't overthink it. The glance he gave them had clearly said, "I know you're there." He didn't say anything else. Batman was just that cold. Of course, a certain tycoon was the exception. After all, Luke had to make a living. Without the tycoon's armor skills, it would be harder and harder for Batman to survive. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to openly wear a suit made with Tony's technology and hang around in it in front of the tycoon. Although the tycoon definitely had a lot of suspicions, he was blocked by Luke's attitude and couldn't ask any more questions. How could he ask? Given Tony's arrogant personality, if he pursued the matter of the bat suit, how could he return the multiple life-saving favors he owed Batman? In front of other people, Tony could still calmly say, "I'll give you a check. Fill in the numbers yourself." But he didn't have that sort of confidence with Batman. Batman saved ordinary people, but did he say anything after that? No. Batman never asked for money when he saved people. This was how Batman always had the upper hand. Matt and Elektra were also now caught in this moral dilemma, and they didn't dare question Batman's actions at all. Why was Batman here? That wasn't important. How did Batman end up saving the kids? That also wasn't important. Nor was it important whether or not Batman knew the inside story. Batman liked to save people. That was more than enough. He never explained himself to anyone. Even though countless people were looking into the important reason for this, which might be related to the origin of this Black Angel, they could only guess. It was impossible for them to get a concrete answer from Batman. After a brief silence, Elektra shook her head. "I'm leaving. I'll come find you again if I have news on the hand." Matt didn't say anything and just went downstairs before he headed for Metro General Hospital. He wanted to take a look at the kids who had been rescued. At that moment, Metro General was busy. More than 10 kids had been sent over, and they were in bad shape. Luke had examined them earlier. Not only were they being drained of blood, there was also a strange mix of toxins in their bodies. He couldn't be considered an absolute dunce in the field of medicine, but he didn't have any healing abilities. Thus, he left the professional matters to the professionals. Treating someone was far more complicated than killing them. It was definitely better to carry out systematic examination and treatment at a place like Metro General Hospital, which had all sorts of equipment and numerous doctors. Standing on top of the building diagonally opposite the hospital, Selina said, "The ninjas who came back as reinforcements were too fast." "Are you sure you didn't trigger an alarm in that building?" "Luke, no." Selina said, "Less than 2 minutes after the police cars set out, the hand ninjas appeared and headed straight for the old building where the kids were locked up. They were probably monitoring the police comms." Luke hummed in agreement. Selina said, "Last time, we monitored Yashitake Shin's body, but none of them showed up. After that, someone in the 15th precinct helped suppress the matter. Will they show up this time?" Luke said, "That's possible. Even if they gave up on the kids, I took something else that should be important to them." After a brief silence, Selina said, "I'll take action when they get here." Luke asked, "Are you sure?" Selina snorted. "I don't kill random people, but these beasts don't deserve to be called human. If they dare come tonight, I'll kill them. If one comes, I'll kill one. If 100 come, I'll kill 100. Pondering for a moment, Luke said, "Well, they probably don't have 100 people, right? These ninjas weren't common. They couldn't be that good in close combat and cold weapons without more than 10 years of training." Stumped for a moment, Selina then said angrily, "I don't care. If there aren't 100 of them tonight, I'll just kill them every time I see them from now on, until I kill 100 of them." Luke finally revealed something to soothe her. "Don't worry, these guys really aren't human. Do you know what I found on Yashitake Shin? A coroner's Y-shaped incision." Selina was surprised. Could it just be a cut to scare people? Although it was a little strange to scare people this way, it made more sense than resurrection. Luke immediately rejected this possibility. No, it wasn't just a flesh wound. It was definitely from an autopsy, he had definitely been examined by a coroner. Selina drew in a sharp breath and understood. Then I don't have to hold back when I run into them. Luke smiled and didn't question her attitude. Apart from himself, he didn't think that many people could kill bad guys diligently without any psychological issues. At the very least, Selina wasn't one of them. But looking at the tragic state of the kids, Selina probably wouldn't be able to rest easy if she didn't torture a few members of the Hand today. In that sense, she was more like a good cop than Luke was. She wanted to protect the innocent, and didn't ask for anything in return. She wanted peace of mind. At that moment, she suddenly looked not far away. Why is Foggy here? Luke didn't say anything and simply used his private number to send a few messages. A moment later, he looked at Foggy's reply and said helplessly, he was looking for Temple, and ran into rival gang members sent here by the police for treatment. They're arguing in the ER now, even in handcuffs, and it looks like another fight is going to break out. Selina was stunned. Where are the patrol officers? Luke said, they needed more hands with the kids who were sent in just now, so a few men were sent over. In any case, if these gang members get into another fight and die, they deserve it. Selina got it. Compared with helping innocent kids, they indeed didn't have to care too much about these gangsters. Even if they were stopped today, they would still die in a robbery or a gunfight in the future. Luke, on the other hand, looked at a dark red figure who was crouched on the roof. That guy's here too. His ex-girlfriend isn't here. It seems that this old flame hasn't been completely stamped out. Selina glanced over and curled her lip. This guy made a mess of things. Foggy found out about his little secret not long ago, and Karen guessed it too. Besides, he's been getting hurt all the time, and has basically left the law firm to Foggy and Karen. Those who don't know might think that it's been renamed Nelson and Page. Pondering for a moment, Luke could only say, it can't be helped. It comes down to looks. Foggy doesn't stand a chance. Selina was lost for words. She felt that she couldn't say anything in good conscience. Luke and Selina chatted idly. Foggy was also busy at the hospital as he used his lawyer skills to keep these brainless gangsters under control. Matt was on the roof behind the hospital opposite them. He was being obedient because Luke had simply used a secret transmission to tell him that he was watching the front entrance. Since Batman had taken the front door, Matt didn't say anything and obediently chose to crouch at the back. He and Luke had similar thoughts. They were very wary of the Hand and were prepared to stand guard here for a while. If the police could send out a large number of officers, the Hand might not make a move. But after a dozen kids were sent to the hospital, only 4 patrol officers had been left behind. It wasn't easy to do any sort of work nowadays, and the police department didn't have enough manpower. The bulk of the police force was at the expo, so naturally, there weren't many people here, thanks to the money which Stark Industries had shelled out. With less than 10 patrol officers present, the Hand wouldn't be too concerned. This organization was different from regular gangs. Their real faces had never been exposed. Luke had investigated them through Gianna, but the companies he uncovered had a tangled and complicated network of involvement in shares, and weren't big. The information from the high table confirmed that the Hand had been around as a force for at least 100 years. They had probably existed before that, but there was no proof. This outrageous organization hadn't been destroyed even after 100 years. They definitely had a lot of connections. The companies that Luke found, for example, were just for appearances. Many of them were just empty shell companies which only received investments when they were needed. It didn't take long for these companies to be completely abandoned. From this point of view, the Hand was as cautious as Luke and his fake identities, the only difference being that their fake identities were in the form of shell companies. Thus, there was only one way to find the main body of the hand. That was through people. Once people from the hand took action, the shell companies lost most of their use as a cover. Like with Luke, as long as any of his aliases was unmasked, all his disguise would be for naught. He knew this was a weakness, but he couldn't solve it, because there were many things he had to do himself, and he had to earn experience and credit points himself. By the same logic, the hand had to take tangible form during an operation. Whether it was the ninjas in red or the people in charge of the digging, they had to have a core in order to control the outcome of things. In other words, it had actually been a waste for Luke to kill Yashitake Shin and all his men in his fury. But he had been happy to do so. Now, he would catch another group of people from the hand. Yashitake Shin had been cautious and moved autonomously. Luke didn't have much information, including how they communicated with each other. Killing Yashitake Shin and taking the stone coffin might fluster the hand into making a mistake. The more anxious a person was, the more likely they would make a mistake, and the more opportunities they would be giving their opponent. Luke was patient. He would wait until the hand's bare ass was exposed before he kicked it. Waiting was boring. Time slowly passed until it was 1 a.m. The paparazzi who had heard about Batman had basically all left the hospital. The kids were all being treated in the ICU, and the officers who had been at the crime scene were replaced to prevent reporters from interviewing them and interrupting the hospital's work. Also, since the details of the case weren't clear, the police department told everybody not to divulge any relevant information for the time being, so the news didn't spread on a large scale. Metro General Hospital was still busy after midnight, but it was much more peaceful than the bustle during the day. At that moment, an ambulance sped over. It entered the hospital through the front entrance, and another ambulance entered from the back at the same time. For a large general hospital, the ambulances were still very busy, even at midnight. Luke didn't think much of it. His attention was focused on two teams of ninjas in black who were charging out on both sides of the hospital. Matt noticed the movements as well. He didn't know why these ninjas had switched out their flashy red for the traditional black, but their movements and steps were exactly the same as before. Take Hellhound into the hospital. Be careful of misdirection, Luke said to Selina. He then revealed himself and lunged at the ninjas on the left. Seeing Batman go left, Matt, who had been ready for action, charged at the other group of ninjas on the right side of the hospital without hesitation. Although Batman didn't give any orders, Matt very consciously took it on himself to act as backup. That was because Batman had never been defeated. A strange whistling sound rang out. It wasn't ear-piercing, but was drawn out and deep, like the sound of a sun. Alarmed, the 8 ninjas on the left scattered and looked into the sky. Thanks to their special training and nocturnal habits, they were able to see the black shadow approaching rapidly from the sky. The enormous cape unfurled to form distinct bat wings. The blood-red lenses on the face flashed, as if scanning for prey, and there was a strange whistling sound. Batman, a ninja cried out. "Shut up and kill him," the lead ninja immediately ordered in a low voice. If it were any other time, the leader would have killed his subordinate without hesitation for his indiscreet shout. But they were facing Batman. Everybody knew that Batman abhorred evil and was obsessed with saving people. These ninjas were no longer human, but they knew that they were definitely bad guys in Batman's eyes since they had killed a lot of ordinary people. Batman and the Hand were natural enemies, there was no possibility of a compromise. The Hand would never compromise with anyone, not even Batman. In the blink of an eye, both parties were about to collide. The enormous bat wings swiftly turned back into a cape. Looking at the 2 blades that were coming at him, Luke tapped his foot lightly. Sensing the enormous black figure charging at them, the 2 ninjas couldn't help but speed up. 2 blades flashed. Luke watched as the 2 katanas intersected in front of him before he avoided the blades and pressed forward. The 2 ninjas were astonished. They turned to the side with their blades. Unfortunately, they hadn't run into an ordinary person. Two big hands grabbed their necks, and they froze. They weren't dead, but could survive for a long time as severely paraplegic patients. Holding them aloft, Luke stepped forward and raised his leg. Pa! Pa! His right leg struck out, and there were two crisp sounds as two ninjas behind him were kicked in the ribs and flew in two different directions. Luke slowly pulled this leg back and pulled the two men in front of him forward to stare at them. The hand, guilty. After pronouncing judgment, he threw the two ninjas aside and charged at the other four ninjas. Bang! The fifth ninja had barely raised his knife, when he was shouldered hard in the chest. There was the sound of bones breaking, and he was sent flying as if he had been hit by a car. Luke grabbed the sixth ninja and threw him at the last one. At the same time, he kicked out, and the seventh ninja's legs bent 90 degrees before he rolled over the ground. At that moment, the two ninjas who had crashed into each other spat out blood and broke even more bones in their bodies. Selena said, "They're in those two ambulances." They entered the underground parking lot. 20 people are headed for the ward. Luke chuckled. "I'll be right there." Selena said, "Don't underestimate me. I won't go easy on them." Luke said, "Okay. I'll clean up the people outside before I head over." As he spoke, he took a running leap into the air above the hospital. He drew out the bat darts from his waist and threw them at the ninjas who were attacking Matt on the right. "Give the darts back to me later," he said to Matt via secret transmission. He landed again before gliding down to the hospital square in the back. Matt was besieged by 8 ninjas. There were too many ninjas in this team. Not only was each of them a good fighter, they all worked well as a team. They were using their advantage in numbers to overwhelm him. Hearing Luke's words, Matt couldn't help but slow down slightly, and a katana swept out at his waist. He twisted with all his strength, almost breaking his waist. The blade flashed past his waist, leaving a cold trail. It was followed by a familiar sting as it left a small cut behind. Matt rolled and kicked the ninjas in his way, finally breaking free of the encirclement. At that moment, he finally recalled Luke's words. He couldn't help but feel suspicious. Darts? What the? Escaping from the fierce battle, he immediately sensed the bat darts whistling through the air. Matt felt his hair stand on end. There were tiny blue dots on the 8 bat darts spinning through the air, and they were picking up speed as they flew at Matt and the ninjas. Matt instantly sensed that these bat darts were different. They were spinning too fast and were still getting faster. In this state, the bat darts would easily cut a person into pieces. For example, the 8 ninjas in front of him. These ninjas were far less sensitive than Matt. They hadn't sensed anything when Matt sensed something was wrong. By the time they sensed the danger, Matt was already tense and ready to avoid any possible injury. By the time the bat darts broke their ranks, they had no chance. Matt, who was standing not far away, heard the sound of the bat darts cutting through flesh and bone. There were 2 bursts of metal colliding, as 2 ninjas were fortunate enough to be able to block the bat darts with their blades. But before they could celebrate, 2 of the other 6 bat darts that had completed their task spun and cut through their knees. In less than a second, the team of 8 ninjas that had been suppressing Matt were all crippled. Matt swallowed hard as the 8 bat darts flew at him. The hair on his back stood on end. He was about to dodge, but they abruptly slowed down and lost momentum a meter in front of him. "Give the darts back to me later," Matt recalled these words and subconsciously stretched out his hand. The bat darts, which had cut through the ninja's legs like they were chicken feet, now lay obediently in his hand. Matt was stunned for a moment, then heard the sounds of battle from the hospital behind him. Alarmed, he realized that the 2 teams of ninjas had just been a distraction for the hand to attack the hospital building. They were definitely doing this to find the kids who had been rescued. Thinking that, Matt was furious. He quickly stepped forward and kicked the heads of all the ninjas who were still struggling, knocking them out. Then, he ran toward the ICU. As he ran, he subconsciously tried waving the bat darts around. He didn't know how to use them, but he was very curious about how they could kill 8 powerful ninjas. The ninjas of the hand weren't wooden stumps. Matt was confident in his skills, but even in close range, he couldn't guarantee that his batons would hit them. But Batman had asked Matt to bring back the bat darts that he had thrown out earlier. Matt felt that this meant that Batman had been confident of the outcome. When he thought this, he found it unbelievable. Actually, if he had the chance to voice his questions, Luke wouldn't hesitate to give him a little hint, a program. A program which analyzed various possible evasive maneuvers, coupled with a target lock program, made the bat darts a weapon similar to a guided missile. Tony was already researching a mini-guided missile. The difficulty lay in the power or the range. But for a weapon like the bat dart that was equipped with the ability to hover in the air and didn't require a long range, it only needed to lock onto a target and attack them. With a small boost in power, it could lock onto a target within a 200-meter range. If it was blocked, it could use auxiliary power to attack 3 more times. Thus, the best way to deal with the bat dart was to catch it and prevent it from rebounding. Without the momentum from the first attack, it would be very hard for the bat dart to be boosted by the auxiliary power for 3 more attacks. But this was also Luke's first time using it against an enemy. The hand ninjas could only blame themselves for not being human. By the time Matt rushed to the ICU, a fierce battle was already in motion. After speaking to Luke, Selina cancelled her stealth mode and walked to the ICU. Several patrol officers looked at the Batet armor in bewilderment and ordered her to stop as they took out their guns. But in less than a minute, the patrol officers disappeared from the hallway, and Selina was left standing at the door they had been guarding. It wasn't because she was arrogant, but because she was using herself to draw the 20 ninjas' attention. If she was invisible and the ninjas were scattered, it would be very hard to ensure the absolute safety of the dozen or so kids, and some of the ninjas might escape. In the underground parking lot, the ninjas got out of the 2 ambulances and went up the stairs to the 4th floor, only to see Selina, who gave them a steady look. Even with their indifference, they were stunned for a moment. The 3rd generation Batet armor was very different from the first 2 generations. It was real armor, not a combat uniform. It looked close-fitting and showed off a woman's curves, but those gentle curves were actually molded by gold titanium. In reality, it was still a powerful suit that was 1.9 meters tall and more than 2 feet wide at the waist. The helmet was in the shape of a cat's face, with 3 white whiskers painted on each cheek and lenses that were the classic green of cat's eyes. It looked more like a powerful black leopard than a black cat. Selina didn't say anything. She simply raised one hand and crooked her index finger at the ninjas tauntingly. None of the ninjas said anything. The leader simply raised his katana and pointed it at Selina. The ninjas in black behind him charged forward, and even before they drew their swords, a storm of shurikens was already flying at Selina. Selina snorted and raised her hands. The armor on the outside of her arms turned into 2 oval-shaped shields. The shurikens aimed at her upper torso bounced off the shields. Then, Selina's body unfolded and she lunged at the 2 ninjas at the front like a female leopard. The oval shields pushed aside 2 katanas slicing down at her, and with a jerk, 4 hands, along with the hilts of the blades they had been holding, fell to the floor. Behind her, 2 blades of 2 ninjas were already above her head. Selina bent down so that her body was almost parallel to the ground. As she charged forward, she swung out her arms, and the sharp edges of the shields literally cut the legs out from under the ninjas on both sides. Rolling to block the katanas of the 3rd team of ninjas, Selina exerted strength in her legs and jumped into the air. She then stepped on the wall on the right. 1 step, 2 steps. She ran right up the wall, and the 2 shields cut off the hands of 2 katana-wielding ninjas. 3 steps, 4 steps. Her body was now at a very small angle from the ceiling. 2 ninjas who jumped up to attack were sliced through the forehead with the shields, and fell. 5 steps, 6 steps. She reached the wall on the left and swung her shields, sending two ninjas who had started to pull their blades back to defend themselves flying. At that moment, the Batet armor finally landed on the ground. In the first group of hand ninjas that had attacked, 6 were crippled, 2 were dead, 2 had light injuries, and only 2 were lucky enough to be unharmed as they turned around behind her. However, neither the 2 ninjas behind her nor the 10 ninjas in front of her dared attack again. In less than 5 seconds, almost half of them were crippled. If they continued charging forward brainlessly, all 20 of them would be dead in 10 seconds. Even the hand ninjas who weren't afraid of death didn't want to be wiped out in 15 seconds. They were elite ninjas who had trained for more than 10 years, not toilet paper to be thrown around. They could die, but it had to be meaningful deaths at the very least. They couldn't just be cut down like firewood. The ninja leader finally spoke. "Who are you?" Selena's green cat eyes flickered, as if mocking them, but she didn't say anything. The ninja continued, "If you step aside, you can put forward a condition. Whether it's money or something else, I can give it to you." He wasn't a subordinate, and had enough autonomy to make this promise. An inflexible ninja wouldn't bring 50 ninjas with him on this kidnapping operation. The white lines which looked like cat whiskers on both sides of Selena's helmet suddenly curled up, as if she was smiling. The ninja leader finally got a reaction, and he immediately asked again, "How much do you want?" "1 million?" Selena's green cat eyes flashed again, and she lowered her head. The ninja leader felt that this mysterious woman was definitely tempted, and was considering his offer. 1 million was enough to make her hesitate. With one look, one could tell that she was poor, yet she was actually trying to copy Batman and uphold justice. How stupid. He sneered inwardly and gestured at his men behind him to prepare for a surprise attack. Just as he was thinking that, he felt something tighten around his neck, and his feet left the ground as he was lifted up. A low voice rang out in the ninja's ear. "You, guilty." Then, the wall on one side of the hallway rushed forward to meet him. Bang! With a muffled sound, half the ninja leader's face was flattened. It wasn't because the guy had a tough head, but because Luke was deliberately keeping him alive. At that moment, the 9 ninjas behind Luke finally regained their senses. In what felt like the blink of an eye, the black giant had grabbed their leader and smashed him into the wall. Kill! A ninja who took his place as interim leader gave a low shout, and the group of ninjas charged forward. Luke turned around at that moment, and his blood-red lenses lit up. "You, guilty." "Batman," another ninja shouted. This time, none of his comrades thought of cutting him down, since they were also shouting it in their hearts. Luke, however, didn't give them a chance to retreat as he charged forward. Bang! 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 3 seconds later, 9 ninjas collapsed in the hallway. Most of them were lying on their backs, and some were kneeling with their heads against the wall. There were also 2 unlucky bastards who could only scream as they clutched their broken limbs. Selena jumped lightly and pulled her knees back. When the 9 ninjas had attacked, the 2 ninjas behind her moved as well. She simply did a backflip to dodge their blades. Grabbing their heads with both hands, she pressed down and hit them in the back with her knees, creating 2 more paraplegics. Luke asked, "What about the 4 patrol officers?" Although this was a trap, he didn't want these innocent patrol officers to lose their lives for it. Selena said, "I locked them up in the guardroom on the side. Just nice, they can let people know and come over now." Most people didn't recognize her 3rd-generation Batet armor. She could only handcuff them and throw them into the room. Luke said, "I'll let them out." Selena nodded. Batman had a lot of prestige. After being released, the 4 officers probably wouldn't think about drawing their guns. Luke went to release them, and Selena went to cripple all the ninjas. These ninjas were crazy. Even if they only had 1 hand and 1 leg, they could still hurt innocent people. She didn't want to give them that chance. As for whether or not they would die of blood loss, that wasn't up to her. She had already shown restraint by not killing them. Luke had said that he wanted to continue using these guys as bait, but it didn't matter if a few of them died. The 4 patrol officers who had just been released by Batman saw her stomp on the ninjas until their limbs cracked. 2 faces turned white and 2 turned dark. The 4 patrol officers subconsciously looked at Batman. Luke didn't say anything and simply leaned against the ICU door. Then, the patrol officers saw a certain devil bone breaker stomp all over the ninjas before nodding at Batman and leaving. How could the 4 patrol officers not understand that this devil bone breaker and Batman were on the same side? They relaxed. When they had been handcuffed by the Black Leopard woman, they thought they had run into a lunatic. At that moment, Lawyer Matt finally arrived. The 4 patrol officers were frightened by his dark red uniform, and thought that he was one of the ninjas' accomplices. Sensing that the ninjas had collapsed, Matt smiled bitterly. This was too strong. This was a narrow hallway. Matt wasn't confident he could deal with 10 ninjas in this terrain, but 20 had fallen here. From the moment Batman threw out the darts to help take down the 8 ninjas, it had taken Matt less than 4 minutes to get here. The fact was that as soon as he entered the first floor, he had sensed that the battle upstairs had ended. For the first time, Matt's ears confirmed how powerful Batman and his partner were. The troublesome hand ninjas were no different from street hooligans in Batman's eyes. Thinking quickly, he walked over to Batman and gave him the darts. Your darts. Luke nodded and used his secret transmission to say, leave right away. There are too many people who are paying attention to me. Don't let them think that we're close. Matt's lips moved when he heard that, but he didn't say anything in the end. He just nodded slightly and left. The 4 patrol officers were stunned. Who was this? Was he here to deliver something? But why was he only delivering the darts to Batman after the fight was over? For a moment, the patrol officers were full of doubts, and nobody spoke to Luke. 10 minutes later, the first batch of patrol officers finally arrived. To their surprise, Batman didn't leave. He remained outside the ICU. This time, 2 officers came forward to ask questions. Luke simply said that the ninjas belonged to the Hand, and that they were the ones who had kidnapped and injured the kids. He didn't say anything else. If he was going to ultimately eradicate the Hand, telling the police more now was useless. He wouldn't be disappointed if the police found the Hand before he did, but that was unlikely. The patrol officers were also very tactful, except for a middle-aged patrol officer who looked like an old fanboy and wanted his autograph. Luke decisively ignored him. Although the others glanced at him every now and then, nobody disturbed him again. 10 minutes later, when ESU reinforcements arrived on the 4th floor, Luke took a running leap out of the window and glided away. The ESU captain was stunned for a moment before he turned to the officers who were guarding the scene. He couldn't help but ask, Batman left the moment we arrived. Does he have a problem with us? The sergeant shook his head with a bitter smile. No, he was afraid that we wouldn't be able to deal with those criminals, so he waited for you to arrive before he left. The ESU captain's expression immediately brightened. Really? Did Batman really say that? The sergeant patted the captain's shoulder. No, I was just guessing. The captain was lost for words. In fact, Luke and Selina hadn't left the hospital. They switched locations and hid in an office in a building not far away. A wide desk was placed in front of the window for the both of them to sit on. They had also removed their helmets. Selina's face was naturally Halle Berry's, and Luke's was Big Ben's. Sucking on a lollipop, Selina asked casually, will the Hand still dare come tonight? Luke rolled his own lollipop in his mouth. I don't think so. But they're not normal. It's fine if we waste some time. Selina nodded. More than 50 ninjas broke into the hospital to kidnap people. That really isn't something a normal person would do. Luke couldn't help but glance at the system. He had only obtained 500 experience and credit points for stopping the ninjas from taking the kids away. Selena and Matt had also helped out, but it was better than nothing. The big boss was still Yashitake Shin and his dozen or so men. Now, the host's experience was 95,000/500,000. Credit, 391,000. These new hand ninjas were all strange. As long as they weren't completely killed, experience and credit points from them wouldn't appear. These ninjas in black who raided the hospital had been overflowing with murderous intent when they attacked. Each of them had definitely killed more than just 1 or 2 people, but there had been no experience and credit points from these 40 or so people. However, this attack on Metro General wasn't like the Riverside attack on Matt. There had only been 8 ninjas then, while there were more than 40 here. There had been practically no eyewitnesses at the river last time. This time, there were at least dozens of eyewitnesses in the hospital and surveillance footage. Everyone at the river back then had died, so it was easy to keep things under wraps. The 40 ninjas in the hospital were crippled but alive. Even if no information could be pried out of them, there was no way to hide their numbers. Also, Batman had stopped them. Batman had personally said that they were the masterminds behind the kidnapping and abuse of more than 10 kids. In a situation like this, the Hand would need to mobilize enough power if they wanted to cover up the truth. The bigger their movements, the more exposed the Hand would be. If this wasn't covered up, Homeland Security and the FBI would come after them. After all, more than 40 ninjas charging into the hospital looked like a terrorist attack. Terrorist attacks were under Homeland Security's jurisdiction, and the FBI had the right to investigate serious criminal offenses. This was an open trap. Unless the Hand stopped operations, it would only become more and more troublesome for them. If there were smart people in the Hand, the best solution was to immediately cut off all contact and hide for a few months. There were a lot of cases that the FBI and Homeland Security had to pay attention to, so priority for this case would inevitably drop until it became nothing more than a record in the archive room. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Luke also knew that the excavation company in Clinton was part of the Hand, and they couldn't open the stone door down in the pit. The Hand had gone to so much effort to dig this huge pit. Luke didn't think they were willing to give up the secret behind the stone door. He didn't believe that core members of the Hand wouldn't take the bait. They stayed at the hospital until dawn. Selena went straight home to catch up on sleep, and Luke went to the police department alone. He asked Dustin what happened at Metro General Hospital last night. Naturally, it was on the news. As long as Batman was involved, it was hard not to be on the news. A lot of people had seen and recorded Batman and the ninjas in the hospital last night. It was thanks to the titanium phones once again. These youngsters would take any chance to prove that they had been at the scene. They used the hospital's Wi-Fi to upload the videos to F2F, making other people envy and hate them as they basked in the admiration, flattery, and scolding of countless people. This was completely in line with the desire of those who wanted to be in the limelight. The morning news was also flooded with reports of the fight between Batman and the ninjas at Metro General Hospital last night. Batman fought a new opponent once more, but there was more to it this time. Many paparazzi had already investigated the children who were being drained of blood, and were digging deeper. They all had insider information. What would make Batman, who had always focused on saving people, go hard on this bunch of ninjas last night? Not only did he cut off a lot of the ninjas' hands and feet, 2 of them had been killed on the spot. This wasn't in line with Batman's usual practice of breaking bones at most. There was only one record of Batman cutting off the arms of 2 monsters outside a hospital in Los Angeles. Because of this, the paparazzi with sharp intuition had already sensed big news, and were working even harder to investigate. Anyone who watched the news would know what had happened, including Dustin and Luke. Dustin looked at him and said, "The higher-ups do want us to send someone to investigate. Are you interested?" Luke thought for a moment, then shook his head. Bad guys beaten up this badly by Batman probably aren't NYPD's business. The others can investigate if they want, but I'll pass. Think about the two people whose limbs were cut off by Batman in Los Angeles last time. In the end, there was no trace of them. Dustin nodded, deep in thought. Alright, I'll send a random team to handle it. The truth was that if they pursued the investigation, it would be hard to say if they were investigating the bad guys or Batman. Some people in the police department seemed to want Dustin to investigate Batman more than the ninjas. Dustin wasn't stupid, and naturally sensed the anomaly. If there was a chance, he wouldn't mind kicking those guys down, but he couldn't use their subtle hints as evidence against them, and could only **assess the matter for now. After that, Luke slipped away. Before going to work, he had pressed the button to modify the inventory's function. If his guess was correct, the modification would be completed by noon. He wasn't in a hurry. After Batman's massacre last night, the more normal his behavior today was, the better. He could do some shopping in New York and buy some special food. If it was tasty, he would remember it and use it as work snacks for the future. If it didn't suit his taste, he could throw it at a certain dog-headed garbage disposal unit. Luke returned to his house in Clinton at 11:30. Selina had yet to get up, while Gold Nugget was already eating snacks and watching cartoons in the living room. After watching cartoons alongside Mindy, it had started looking for them on its own. These were perennial cartoons that could easily run for over a decade or even several decades. They were most suitable for this excessively spirited alien dog head. When it saw Luke come back with takeout, it perked up and whined. Luke didn't indulge it. There are a few more boxes downstairs. Bring them up, and we'll start eating. The dog dashed off. Luke was only carrying 4 big bags. Compared with the boxes, there was a clear difference in amount. It had the biggest appetite and ate the most. If it didn't do any work, the fiend would lecture it. Every time the fiend lectured it, it always sensed a strange light which flashed in Luke's eyes. It didn't want to verify what the fiend said happened to disobedient kids. Like high school kids who scolded forum moderators and got their accounts banned forever. Or kids who squandered money on their phone game accounts until their credit dropped into the negatives, and the games were uninstalled and the phones were set to kids mode so that they could only call and text. A certain dog head who was highly addicted to the internet and dramas didn't want anything like that to happen to it. A few minutes later, 1 man and 1 dog were trying the food at the dining table. Luke had a bite of everything first. If it was delicious, he would put it aside and wait for Selina to come back to eat together. He put whatever didn't suit his taste but would probably suit Selina's to another side. Whatever he and Selina didn't like, he poured into Gold Nugget's bowl. Gold Nugget licked the bowl clean with a few swipes of its big tongue. At the same time, Luke was focusing on the system. After using the bottle-shaped stone coffin, there wasn't any discernible change to the inventory's function. At the very least, there was no third space. After he harassed the system, however, it gave him a simple explanation: Space 2 was equipped with a hibernate function. Luke couldn't make head or tail of it. This explanation was too vague. He had to slowly test whether this meant that any living thing thrown into the space would fall asleep, fall into a coma, or even freeze. Would all living things hibernate, or just some of them? Was there a difference or limit in time? He still needed to test this out bit by bit. Thankfully, Luke was already used to this life. Every day, he was either running tests or waiting to finish work before running off to run tests. If he wasn't experimenting on himself, it was on something else. As long as he treated the experiments as an interest and a hobby, he could persist with them. Also, the things he experimented on were very complicated. If he got tired of one, he would switch to another. He had a lot of research to do, and never got bored. Putting aside his main focus on weapons and armor, in order to test new driving technology, for example, he came up with high-end products like KIT, the retro Vespa scooter and the Harley Fat Boy. As for practical vehicles, there was the SUV for everyday use, the small stealth plane for long-distance travel and so on. These were purely experiments in driving. He also experimented with watches, glasses, belts and necklaces, whether to be used as weapons or as side experiments. The tycoon's abilities gave Luke the capital to tinker with all sorts of technological and industrial products and to treat them like toys. It hadn't been in vain for him to save the tycoon several times. By the time Luke had tasted all the food and tossed 1/3 to Gold Nugget, Selina had finally washed up and come downstairs. Walking lazily through the living room, she casually ordered, "I want to see news on Batman's operation last night." Little Snail immediately turned on the TV and adjusted the volume so that it was clear and not too loud. Selina walked straight to the dining table, sat down, and nudged Gold Nugget. "Move, you're in the way." The dog head didn't think much of it. It was satisfied with a lot of snacks, and just let Dollar come out to lick Selina. Selina was much gentler with Dollar. She laughed and pushed it around with her foot for a long while before she told it to play on its own. Eating the delicious food that was on the table, Selina listened to Luke's explanation of Dustin's attitude and simply nodded dispiritedly. In fact, Luke wasn't in a good mood either. What the hand did was really disgusting. Not only did they catch a bunch of kids, they were even draining them of blood for that weird ritual. The children whom they had rescued were still in critical condition. They also had complicated biological toxins in their bodies which could still take their lives at any moment. After the kids were sent to the hospital, the hand didn't give up, and a large group of ninjas had immediately gone over. They had no scruples nor any bottom line. Even if Luke had always planned to drag them out, it was still uncomfortable to run into such a heartless organization. Several days passed, and while the children's abductions and Batman's rescue were still on the news, there was no follow-up. The 40 or so ninjas who were still alive were locked up in prison. There was no movement from the hand to rescue them this time. But these crippled ninjas didn't disclose any information. They were like puppets, and let the agents interrogate them without saying anything. Luke and Selina were as free as ever on the surface. Selina went shopping twice and bought a lot of new clothes for spring. As promised, Luke gave Mindy, Nikki and Monica their first combat lesson. This time, he didn't have to fight them anymore. He just needed to guide them as they trained. After all, there was too big a difference in strength, and it was more suitable to spar with someone on a similar level. During the conversation, Mindy let slip that she had settled the score with her previous good friends, Brooke and the others. Looking at Nikki and Monica's slightly green faces, Luke made a bold guess. "Where did you settle the score?" Monica couldn't help retching again, and Nikki used her powerful muscles to suppress the urge. She said, "In the cafeteria at noon." Luke nodded and stopped asking. Of the various small inventions that Bent had sent to the New Hope Research Center a few days ago, the stick sick was the only thing missing. Bent left a message for his boss on the lab's internal system, saying that he had given the item to a friend. If the company needed it, he could immediately make another one. Naturally, Luke didn't need Bent to make another one. What he wanted were the theories and ideas behind these inventions. He could make a concrete product at any time, and the practical effects would only be better. But it just so happened that Bent's friend had appeared during the last 2 days of the expo. It was probably none other than Damon. Giving it to Damon was no different from giving it to Mindy. When Luke sent Mindy home after the combat class, he asked, "When you were settling the score with Brooke and the others, did you record it?" Mindy rolled her eyes and immediately replied, "No." Luke nodded and stuck his phone on the dashboard. "What a shame. Search for videos of Dalton Junior High, cafeteria and vomit." These words immediately appeared in the search bar, and several videos appeared. The phone automatically played the first one. On the screen, Brooke was sitting at a messy table, and she screamed and tried to get up to run, before she jerked and abruptly bent over. Behind her was Mindy's sneering face and the taser which she had just put away. At the same time, vomit spurted out of Brooke's mouth like a fountain. There was also a mud-colored, indescribable thing under her short skirt, which instantly flooded the chair. "Close the video," Luke said decisively. *CK, he felt like he would be smelling the stench from the screen for the next few days. "Aren't you afraid of being expelled?" He looked away from the screen and asked. A few minutes later, one man and one dog were trying the food at the dining table. Luke had a bite of everything first. If it was delicious, he would put it aside and wait for Selena to come back to eat together. He put whatever didn't suit his taste but would probably suit Selena's to another side. Whatever he and Selena didn't like, he poured into Gold Nugget's bowl. Gold Nugget licked the bowl clean with a few swipes of its big tongue. At the same time, Luke was focusing on the system. After using the bottle-shaped stone coffin, there wasn't any discernible change to the inventory's function. At the very least, there was no third space. After he harassed the system, however, it gave him a simple explanation: Space 2 was equipped with a hibernate function. Luke couldn't make head or tail of it. This explanation was too vague. He had to slowly test whether this meant that any living thing thrown into the space would fall asleep, fall into a coma, or even freeze. Would all living things hibernate, or just some of them? Was there a difference or limit in time? He still needed to test this out bit by bit. Thankfully, Luke was already used to this life. Every day, he was either running tests or waiting to finish work before running off to run tests. If he wasn't experimenting on himself, it was on something else. As long as he treated the experiments as an interest and a hobby, he could persist with them. Also, the things he experimented on were very complicated. If he got tired of one, he would switch to another. He had a lot of research to do, and never got bored. Putting aside his main focus on weapons and armor, in order to test new driving technology, for example, he came up with high-end products like Kit, the retro Vespa scooter and the Harley Fat Boy. As for practical vehicles, there was the SUV for everyday use, the small stealth plane for long-distance travel and so on. These were purely experiments in driving. He also experimented with watches, glasses, belts and necklaces, whether to be used as weapons or as side experiments. The Tycoon's abilities gave Luke the capital to tinker with all sorts of technological and industrial products and to treat them like toys. It hadn't been in vain for him to save the Tycoon several times. By the time Luke had tasted all the food and tossed 1/3 to Gold Nugget, Selena had finally washed up and come downstairs. Walking lazily through the living room, she casually ordered, "I want to see news on Batman's operation last night." Little Snail immediately turned on the TV and adjusted the volume so that it was clear and not too loud. Selena walked straight to the dining table, sat down, and nudged Gold Nugget. "Move, you're in the way." The dog head didn't think much of it. It was satisfied with a lot of snacks, and just let Dollar come out to lick Selena. Selena was much gentler with Dollar. She laughed and pushed it around with her foot for a long while before she told it to play on its own. Eating the delicious food that was on the table, Selena listened to Luke's explanation of Dustin's attitude and simply nodded dispiritedly. In fact, Luke wasn't in a good mood either. What the hand did was really disgusting. Not only did they catch a bunch of kids, they were even draining them of blood for that weird ritual. The children whom they had rescued were still in critical condition. They also had complicated biological toxins in their bodies which could still take their lives at any moment. After the kids were sent to the hospital, the hand didn't give up, and a large group of ninjas had immediately gone over. They had no scruples nor any bottom line. Even if Luke had always planned to drag them out, it was still uncomfortable to run into such a heartless organization. Several days passed, and while the children's abductions and Batman's rescue were still on the news, there was no follow-up. The 40 or so ninjas who were still alive were locked up in prison. There was no movement from the hand to rescue them this time. But these crippled ninjas didn't disclose any information. They were like puppets, and let the agents interrogate them without saying anything. Luke and Selena were as free as ever on the surface. Selena went shopping twice and bought a lot of new clothes for spring. As promised, Luke gave Mindy, Nikki and Monica their first combat lesson. This time, he didn't have to fight them anymore. He just needed to guide them as they trained. After all, there was too big a difference in strength, and it was more suitable to spar with someone on a similar level. During the conversation, Mindy let slip that she had settled the score with her previous good friends, Brooke and the others. Looking at Nikki and Monica's slightly green faces, Luke made a bold guess. "Where did you settle the score?" Monica couldn't help retching again, and Nikki used her powerful muscles to suppress the urge. She said, "In the cafeteria at noon." Luke nodded and stopped asking. Of the various small inventions that Bent had sent to the New Hope Research Center a few days ago, the stick sick was the only thing missing. Bent left a message for his boss on the lab's internal system, saying that he had given the item to a friend. If the company needed it, he could immediately make another one. Naturally, Luke didn't need Bent to make another one. What he wanted were the theories and ideas behind these inventions. He could make a concrete product at any time, and the practical effects would only be better. But it just so happened that Bent's friend had appeared during the last 2 days of the expo. It was probably none other than Damon. Giving it to Damon was no different from giving it to Mindy. When Luke sent Mindy home after the combat class, he asked, "When you were settling the score with Brooke and the others, did you record it?" Mindy rolled her eyes and immediately replied, "No." Luke nodded and stuck his phone on the dashboard. "What a shame. Search for videos of Dalton Junior High, cafeteria and vomit." These words immediately appeared in the search bar, and several videos appeared. The phone automatically played the first one. On the screen, Brooke was sitting at a messy table, and she screamed and tried to get up to run, before she jerked and abruptly bent over. Behind her was Mindy's sneering face and the taser which she had just put away. At the same time, vomit spurted out of Brooke's mouth like a fountain. There was also a mud-colored, indescribable thing under her short skirt, which instantly flooded the chair. "Close the video," Luke said decisively. *CK, he felt like he would be smelling the stench from the screen for the next few days. "Aren't you afraid of being expelled?" He looked away from the screen and asked. Carol had always been a person who knew her limits. After obtaining her superpower, she spent most of her time hiding and didn't dare expose herself. She was reluctant to let someone else risk their life for her, even if this Mr. Mysterious had said several times that it was for the money. After being on the run together for a year, Carol would have pleaded for Lorna's rescue if the latter had been caught. As for the others, she had known them for less than 2 months. She couldn't say that they were very close, and could only apologize. She didn't believe it when Lorna and the others kept going on about how superhumans were all family. When she was still an ordinary person, she had been killed by ordinary gang members, but it was another ordinary person like Luke who had helped her out. So, she felt that family had nothing to do with superpowers. The family in her heart wasn't that cheap. Looking at Carol, who was quiet and had her head down, Luke chuckled. "All right, I'm going to make a fortune, not die. Don't worry. Be a good janitor." They reached the entrance of the building by then. Luke waved at her to go back. Seeing that he was about to leave, Carol couldn't help but ask, "What should I call you?" Luke tilted his head and thought for a moment. Crazy for money, a mercenary for hire, ruthless methods, and guaranteed to get the job done, all up, it was like. "Just call me Wilson," he said. Carol nodded. "Okay. Goodbye, Mr. Wilson. Please come back safely. You can always make money in other ways." Looking at her, Luke sighed and patted her shoulder. "Don't be too kind, or you'll be poor forever." Carol, huh? Luke didn't continue. Carol was too soft-hearted. He would exclude her from his trainee list in the future if she wasn't necessary. Such a good person would definitely be the first to die on the battlefield. Wait, she had elementary self-healing. It seemed it wouldn't be easy for her to die. Amused, Luke shook his head and put aside his ridiculous thoughts as he disappeared into the darkness. Carol didn't return to the apartment until she saw him disappear around the corner. Lorna pretended to be watching TV, but shot a glance at Carol. After Carol sat down on the couch, Lorna finally couldn't help but ask, "What did he say to you?" Carol's lips moved, and she finally swallowed the words about Mr. Wilson looking for trouble with Sentinel Services. Lorna had an extraordinary affinity with those comrades. If she knew what Mr. Wilson was up to, she might ask him to help her save them. The crux was that she had more comrades. From what she said, 20 to 30 of them had been captured by Sentinel Services. Carol couldn't think how one person could take 20 to 30 people out of the research base on his own. After running for so long, she realized that the more people there were, the faster her whereabouts would be exposed. If Mr. Wilson brought a bunch of people with him, he would probably be hunted down by Sentinel Services. Thinking that, she took out the 2 wads of cash from her pocket and gave one to Lorna. "He came to give us living expenses in case we starve to death before we get paid." Looking at the cash, Lorna was stunned for a moment. Her face flushed as she threw the money to the side. "No, I'm not a beggar." Carol chuckled and put her wad away. "I've already told him that we'll pay it back once we start earning money." Lorna. After Carol went to pack her own things, Lorna quietly put away her living expenses, and blushed. This was really embarrassing. Thankfully, Carol wouldn't laugh at her. The next morning, Luke showed up at the police department and took 2 cases before he left Dustin's office. He then drove home. Half an hour later, he boarded a flight to Vancouver as an average-looking white man. 7 hours later, the man left downtown Vancouver in the rain and headed for the desolate outskirts. Before long, a very ordinary and small fixed-wing plane rose from the outskirts and flew north. As the plane headed north, the weather gradually turned cold and the rain got lighter. Canada had the second-largest landmass in the world, second only to Russia, but it only had a population of 30 million. If the American outback was desolate, then the Canadian outback was practically uninhabited. As long as a person had some connections in America, it was very suitable to build a secret base here. Also, British Columbia was close to the United States, which was why Sentinel Services had moved the research base here. Canada airspace was completely open to the United States, so whoever was in charge from Sentinel Services could report back to DC anytime. The plane landed half an hour later, and Luke put it away in his inventory. Then, he took out a brand new Big Dipper armor. After activating the stealth system, 4 auxiliary flight wings popped out of his back, and the mini jets on them used minimal output as Luke stuck close to the ground while he continued north. After traveling the last 20 kilometers, he saw a lake. Alkali Lake was indeed small in comparison with the many other lakes in Canada, but on Luke's approach, the lake opened up. At the start of spring, the countryside was still bleak, there was no sense of it at all here, and it was no different from the vast wilderness which Luke had flown through. Luke sent up a medium-sized drone to monitor dozens of kilometers up ahead. It was around 6 in the evening, and the sky was starting to get dark. The stealth system was more useful in an environment with insufficient light. He would wait until night to take action. He could still rest for an hour. Hiding in the woods next to the lake, Luke ate chocolate to replenish his energy while he adjusted the plan on the armor's virtual interface. It actually wouldn't be hard for him to break into the research base. If he wanted to squeeze out the maximum value of this research base, however, he couldn't give the other party too much time to react. A secret research facility like this, which couldn't see the light of day, would destroy evidence if something went wrong. Evidence like research data was one thing, but superhumans who were left alive were also witnesses. The person in charge of the research base might blow it up, which would make this a wasted trip. Rubbing his chin, Luke felt that it still depended on the situation. If he could take care of the surveillance system, he could fall back on his old line of business, sneaking in. After sneaking in, he would deal with the surveillance room first, then the leader, and the lackeys last. As long as he proceeded quietly, he would be able to take over the base in the end. At that time, he could slowly count his gains. But this was a secret base, after all, as well as a very professional military base. Even if nothing unexpected happened, the chances of taking everyone down weren't very high. As long as the base had an emergency protocol in its security system, the possibility that it would self-destruct was very high. As a security measure, there should be more than one surveillance room. At the very least, there should be timed security check-ins. It wouldn't be possible to fool the guards inside forever. Luke couldn't help but scratch his head. He had too few trustworthy teammates. In a situation like this, numbers were the best solution. If he had more than 5 strong teammates, he was 80% confident that he could take down the base intact. If he had 10 teammates, he was 90% confident. But the prerequisite was that these teammates had to be reliable, not just in terms of their combat ability, but also their characters. Otherwise, if they retreated or hesitated, they might lose everything. A teammate hence couldn't be chosen at random, even an idiot teammate could get God killed. The sky finally turned completely dark. Luke felt his way to what he confirmed to be the entrance. It was a dam at one end of Alkali Lake. There was a small road near the bank that led to a metal gate at the end. Nobody had been in or out of this place for the past hour, but based on the condition of the road and the surroundings, cars often passed through the metal gate. As long as they moved, they would leave traces behind. No matter what, a base couldn't be completely concealed. At the very least, it required daily food and necessities. For example, Luke didn't believe that the people here didn't use toilet paper. The ground was bare 100 meters all around the gate, and there was no cover. Luke didn't plan to take the risk, and could only observe from 100 meters away. The multiple surveillance cameras around the metal gate as well as the smell of cars, supplies, and people reaffirmed his guess. Luke wasn't in a hurry to take action. The more experience he accumulated, the more mature he became. In the past, he had always felt a sense of urgency when it came to accumulating points. Now that he thought about it, being so impetuous wasn't the right way to do things. The experience and credit points were right there. If he rushed things, he wouldn't earn much. Instead, he might get innocent people killed, which wasn't the outcome he wanted. There were no lights on the metal gate, only the red dots of light from the surveillance cameras indicated that the entrance was under heavy surveillance. The dam's layout didn't allow for more access points. Apart from this main entrance, there was only one other side door. But Luke didn't plan to go in that way. The side door would definitely have more surveillance that would be harder to avoid, there was more leeway with the main entrance. Suddenly, Luke perked up and quietly drew back. The drone in the sky suddenly sent a message: cars were headed toward the dam. They certainly weren't out for a midnight spin. There were 2 SUVs escorting a big freight truck in the front and back. They didn't look like they were here to deliver daily necessities. Invisible, Luke darted under the bottom of the truck and stuck to it with his hands and feet before he moved closer to the front. A thin wire stretched out of the armor's palm and burrowed into a crack under the front of the car. It quickly found a data cable, and Luke swiftly typed out a string of code. He darted out from the side of the truck and landed lightly on the grass next to the road. The entire procedure took him less than 20 seconds. The truck was as steady as ever. When it was within 100 meters of the metal gate, Luke activated the small program which he had just implanted in the vehicle's steering system. At a corner on a downward slope, the truck didn't turn or brake. It suddenly charged off the road and onto the grass on the side. Several seconds later, the truck finally stopped in a slight depression in the ground. The 2 SUVs reacted quickly and braked almost immediately. A total of 8 people got out, all of whom were wearing familiar black combat uniforms and full gear. In fact, Luke could already hear the other party's notification and request for backup in his earpiece. He still didn't take action. He returned to the woods and silently observed everything. 8 combat soldiers guarded the truck. One of them talked to the truck driver for a few minutes, before he helplessly chose to call for help. Eagle's Nest, the delivery van has broken down and can't be started. Please send another vehicle to pick up the packages. 5 minutes later, a truck similar to the one mired in the mud drove out of the gate. It was accompanied by a dozen combat soldiers. After meeting up with the 8 combat soldiers, they opened the back doors of the truck that was stuck and carried out some rigid support frames. A superhuman was bound to each support frame by their 4 limbs, head, neck and chest. They were all unconscious. In less than 10 minutes, 6 people were transferred to the new truck. Closing the back doors of the truck, the guard at the front gestured at the driver to hurry up and drive into the base, while the others remained on high alert. At that moment, in a bungalow in Washington, a Caucasian man in his 40s was pacing back and forth in the living room with the phone in his hand. He frowned and asked, "Are you sure it was just a car breakdown?" On the screen, a woman in a black leather jacket and pants said, "Yes. Also, the same thing happened to the Benz at the end of last year." The middle-aged man was stumped. "Really? Why didn't I know that?" The woman in leather said, "Because it happened when the car was in the garage at the base." After that, Ben's customer service said that the smart suspension control system just needed to be updated. The middle-aged man asked, "So?" The woman in leather said, "The logistics department will send the truck off to update its program." The middle-aged man waited a few seconds. "That's all?" The woman in leather said, "They said there's no oil leak. At most, they'll give us 2 more car services after this one." The middle-aged man had an ugly expression on his face. Damn capitalists. Such an expensive car, and there's still problems with it. We should really turn them into test subjects. That being said, he knew very well that if he really pissed the other party off, the biggest possibility was that his own men would send him to the operating table as a test subject. This was the power of money and influence. All his authority came from the big shots who had both these things. The big shots could give him this authority, and naturally, they could take it back. The big shot behind him wasn't from Benz, but in an exchange of benefits, dealing with him would at most be a bonus. Thinking that, he became even more depressed. Also, he had received a call from the higher-ups not long ago, expressing that a colleague in Division B had done a good job. The middle-aged man knew what the other party was implying. The higher-ups weren't satisfied with the resources he had expended and the results he had obtained. If it wasn't for the fact that Division B's research direction was slightly off and didn't meet the big shots' requirements for transforming their own bodies, they would have nothing to do with Division A. In fact, Division A had made major progress in their research, but it was still far from the man-made, safe and controlled final outcome that some people imagined. He was greedy for capital. It was impossible to buy a Bugatti with money that was only enough for 2 shoddy cars. Even though Sentinel Services had invested billions of dollars and had been around for more than 10 years, to achieve their ultimate goal, this was really only the beginning. It would take at least 100 years and more than $1 trillion to achieve this goal. Could it be achieved with just a few billion over a decade? If there was really such a good thing, who would be stupid enough to give all the benefits away? Like him, for example, he had only gotten some benefits. He looked at the woman in leather on the phone. Unfortunately, those guys couldn't accept just this small amount of benefits. Of course, in exchange for these small personal benefits, he had to use the research base's best research outcomes for the moment, and spend almost $200 million in raw materials. He had to even fork out some personal resources to cover things. If he was willing to sell off his benefits, however, they would be worth at least $1 billion. But he couldn't do that unless he was confident he could escape, or couldn't do it anymore. The blame for a number of things that he had done in the name of Sentinel Services all these years would silently fall on his head. As long as he looked like he wanted to run, the big shots would throw the blame on him. The more he thought about it, the more depressed he became. The middle-aged man didn't continue. Fine. Be careful. Let me know if anything happens. By the time the call ended, the truck had already moved the packages into the base. The reason why the base had deployed a special truck even so close to the base still came down to the understanding that the longer the 6 packages were exposed outside, the more dangerous it was, and the more complicated the subsequent procedure for entering the warehouse would be. Actually, the heads of the 6 packages had been covered with black hoods to hide their appearances before they were taken out of the truck that had broken down. At that moment, Luke was in the back of the second truck and close to the front in a blind spot. When they were moving the packages, he had found an opportunity to slip inside, and muscle control prevented anyone from noticing his movements. After the truck entered the base, the doors opened again, and he followed the people who took the packages out of the truck. First stage of his secret infiltration, accomplished. He didn't continue following the men with the packages, but veered away and darted into a dead end. A moment later, several mini-drones flew into a ventilation duct in the corner. The entire base was inside the dam. The ventilation system had to be good, or nobody could stay here for long. Of course, it wasn't like in the movies, where people could move through the ducts. The ventilation system here could only allow a 7- or 8-year-old at most to pass through, provided that the vibration and infrared sensors in the ducts weren't set off. Leaning against the wall, Luke lightly hummed a tune. His voice wouldn't travel out of the armor, he was just having a bit of fun. On the virtual screen, he was directing the mini-drones to move forward. As a map of the ventilation system took shape, the layout of the entire base became clearer. As long as there were rooms for people to stay in, there had to be plenty of ventilation ducts. What Luke needed most this time was abilities, and from living people, so any other information wasn't as useful to him. If superpowers could be controlled well enough, what need was there for Iron Man? Tony's technology was clearly far more cost-effective and practical than relying on the development of superpowers. Ordinary people already had a lot of complicated conditions that couldn't be treated, but these people actually wanted to create superpowers. In the end, this came down to genetics. The foundation for treating most human diseases was the study of genes, and superpowers were one step beyond that. It was like how one had to be healthy first before they could think about longevity, and only then consider longevity itself. These greedy guys wanted to skip the basics and directly obtain superpowers. Tony had never dwelled on this matter because he knew that even if Stark Industries invested everything they had, they might not get much out of it. A capital of hundreds of billions could only be considered a deposit, and it came to basic research on human genetics. Of course, Tony himself was more interested in machines and industrial products. If this son of destiny turned his creative endeavors to gene technology, it might indeed be possible for him to create something extraordinary. But geniuses all had their own quirks. As long as they weren't interested, it would take twice the effort to get them to work on a particular project. Luke, who had been using the tycoon's abilities for a long time, also leaned a little toward this. But the bigger reason was that he didn't need gene technology to obtain superpowers. Daddy's system was enough. Using gene technology to give a person more than 2 types of abilities wasn't a matter of adding them together, it was like the difference between a car and a spaceship. Compared with using gene technology to manufacture superpowers, far in the indefinite future, Luke still chose the system. Although it didn't offer magic abilities, what abilities it did provide could be learned quickly and were good. Thus, Luke, who wasn't greedy for more, was calm and spent 5 hours in that tiny blind spot. The mini-drones were sent out in batches, and there were 50 of them in total. They were positioned near the ventilation ducts in key rooms to be Luke's ears. There were more than 200 combat soldiers and more than 20 researchers in this base. But from what they said, it seemed that Mr. Trask, the person in charge of the project, wasn't here. Instead, the person with the highest authority here was a woman whom they called Miss Miller. This Miss Miller entered the project manager's room and didn't come out again after that. The room was as quiet as a morgue. Luke simply made a note of the woman as an important target, and didn't probe further. If everything went according to plan, he would definitely run into her later. Since she was a woman, however, the matter might be very simple. Apart from this person, however, only one of the researchers at the base was a woman, so there wasn't much that elementary pheromone control could do. It was 3 in the morning, and most of the people in the base were resting. Only the soldiers on night shift were still patrolling diligently. But that was just on the surface. This was the Canadian wilderness. Anybody on the approach would be discovered several kilometers away. These patrol officers were already used to this, and weren't very vigilant. Luke didn't waste any more time and started moving. His first target was still the surveillance room, followed by Miss Miller, the interim leader, and then the captains of the combat teams. The reason why taking the leaders out first was a commonly used strategy was naturally because it was effective. Once the leaders who had the authority to make decisions were out of the picture, nobody else in this secret base would have the authority to activate the self-destruct system. This was an inevitable choice. Until the very end, nobody would be stupid enough to give that sort of authority to mid- and low-level management. It would be a joke if the base self-destructed just because the enemy took care of a few small soldiers. This base's timed security check-ins were at 10-minute intervals. If nothing went wrong, it would still only take at most 10 minutes for the others to notice that something wasn't right with the surveillance room. This meant that Luke had to take care of several important targets in under 10 minutes. "Play a BGM, Polaris," he casually instructed. "Born to Die is a good one." "Yes, sir." The smart program, Polaris, immediately obeyed. "Feet Don't Fail Me Now, Take Me to the Finish Line," Stephanie's debut song, Born to Die, rang out in his ears. This song had yet to be released. He was playing a sample recorded by Sponge, and while the editing still fell far short, Stephanie's singing wasn't bad at all, and wasn't much different from the original. To the tune of a famous song from his previous life, Luke began his killing spree tonight. One of the drones, which had already been on standby, used a low-power laser to cut a data cable, before it lodged itself in the gap. Data link. Data link successful. Decoding completed. Initialize login. Login successful. Luke immediately activated a second drone inside the surveillance room. Faint smoke entered the surveillance room through the ventilation duct and quickly spread out. Looking at the 4 people in the surveillance room who collapsed limply in their chairs on his surveillance feed, Luke smiled. Second stage of his secret infiltration, accomplished. Look at how soundless this infiltration was. Infiltrating physically in the past had been like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Muttering to himself, Luke immediately wondered how many points he could earn from getting rid of the 200 guards. Whatever, take them all down. He had to make a living too. A physical infiltration was always the fastest way to obtain the spoils. What use was his fake identity otherwise? After seizing control of the surveillance system, he left the corner and headed for Miss Miller's room. The lights in the base were dim at night. Without any interference from the surveillance system, the armor was more than stealthy enough to the naked eye. This damn base wasn't too big. In less than a minute, Luke was standing in front of Miss Miller's door. He placed his hand on the combination lock at the door. The smart program, Polaris, cracked this simple access system in 30 seconds. The door opened. Luke walked in and the door closed. This room was different from the other rooms. It was a double suite, and Miss Miller was in a smaller bedroom. He walked over right away, but the door suddenly opened and a shadow rushed out. Her arms swung out and she charged at him. Surprised, Luke cancelled stealth mode. The Big Dipper armor's stealth system came from Tony, and was deliberately different from Batman's stealth system, which was created with the Predator's technology. The most obvious difference was that when stealth mode was cancelled, there was a colored fluctuation as Luke's transparent form quickly turned solid. The black and white skull helmet and the black eye sockets were absolutely low-key. He finally said, "You can see me?" Miss Miller, who was wearing an indifferent expression, was still wearing a black leather jacket, but there were 10 cm long silver blades on her hands. Even stranger, these weren't gloves, but extended right out of her fingertips, and sharp nose detected the faint scent of blood. It was clear they had broken through the skin on her fingertips. There was no blood at the base of the blades, as if the skin had already wrapped around them. While he was observing the other party was also observing him. Her eyes glowed a bright red, which startled Luke. A Terminator? Then, he felt that he was overthinking it. Although this woman was wearing leather, and had red eyes and finger blades, she could be considered an old acquaintance, and her leather jacket wasn't dark red. Terminator or whatever, he was just overthinking it. The other party remained vigilant and didn't move. Luke didn't want to wait any longer. Although running into this woman was a pleasant surprise, there was no need to waste time. He charged at Miller. Miller's eyes glowed red, and she slashed at Luke with both hands like a whirlwind. Suddenly, she froze. It was a short but fatal pause. When Luke had spoken earlier, the effect of elementary pheromone control had been multiplied. The moment she froze, Luke's left fist broke through the finger blades and hammered down on her head. Duong. There was a slightly muffled metallic sound, and Miller staggered 2 steps, but her mind seemed to clear up a little, and she tried to retreat. Surprised, Luke flexed his fist and exclaimed, "What a hardhead." As he spoke, he followed up with his right fist. Duong. Duong. Miller, who had just regained her balance, was punched twice again in the head. This time, she finally couldn't take it anymore, and she fell backward onto the floor with a bang. Luke's expression changed. Why did she sound like a fatty who weighed hundreds of kilograms? She hadn't been that heavy the last time he saw her. He crouched down and flicked the woman's forehead with a finger. The skin on her forehead caved a little, and there was another metallic echo. Unexpectedly, this woman had a literal hard head. Her skull was actually all metal, and very hard at that. It was truly amazing. The system notification popped up. System, defeat Alice Miller. Mission accomplished. Total experience, 100. Total credit, 100. Contribution rate, 100%. EXP plus 100. Credit plus 100. Luke was stunned. So little. Looking at the system interface, he saw that Alice Miller was only a light red evil. He felt a little pained. Had he hit the wrong person? But the arrow was already knocked, and he had to let it fly. Now was not the time to think about this problem. Luke pressed down on her head and, with a thought, put Alice Miller into space 2. Activate hibernate function, he ordered. Almost instantly, he received feedback from the system. System, living organism hibernation January 1st. Time limit, 30 days. Cost, 20 credit points a day. He only pondered this notification for a moment before he gave up. Now wasn't a good time to test this hibernate function. The most important thing was to complete his objective. The reason why taking the leaders out first was a commonly used strategy was naturally because it was effective. Once the leaders who had the authority to make decisions were out of the picture, nobody else in this secret base would have the authority to activate the self-destruct system. This was an inevitable choice. Until the very end, nobody would be stupid enough to give that sort of authority to mid- and low-level management. It would be a joke if the base self-destructed just because the enemy took care of a few small soldiers. This base's timed security check-ins were at 10-minute intervals. If nothing went wrong, it would still only take at most 10 minutes for the others to notice that something wasn't right with the surveillance room. This meant that Luke had to take care of several important targets in under 10 minutes. Play a BGM, Polaris, he casually instructed. Born to Die is a good one. Yes, sir. The smart program, Polaris, immediately obeyed. Feet Don't Fail Me Now, Take Me to the Finish Line, Stephanie's debut song, Born to Die, rang out in his ears. This song had yet to be released. He was playing a sample recorded by Sponge, and while the editing still fell far short, Stephanie's singing wasn't bad at all, and wasn't much different from the original. To the tune of a famous song from his previous life, Luke began his killing spree tonight. One of the drones, which had already been on standby, used a low-power laser to cut a data cable, before it lodged itself in the gap. Data link. Data link successful. Decoding completed. Initialize login. Login successful. Luke immediately activated a second drone inside the surveillance room. Faint smoke entered the surveillance room through the ventilation duct and quickly spread out. Looking at the 4 people in the surveillance room who collapsed limply in their chairs on his surveillance feed, Luke smiled. Second stage of his secret infiltration, accomplished. Look at how soundless this infiltration was. Infiltrating physically in the past had been like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Muttering to himself, Luke immediately wondered how many points he could earn from getting rid of the 200 guards. Whatever, take them all down. He had to make a living too. A physical infiltration was always the fastest way to obtain the spoils. What use was his fake identity otherwise? After seizing control of the surveillance system, he left the corner and headed for Miss Miller's room. The lights in the base were dim at night. Without any interference from the surveillance system, the armor was more than stealthy enough to the naked eye. This damn base wasn't too big. In less than a minute, Luke was standing in front of Miss Miller's door. He placed his hand on the combination lock at the door. The smart program, Polaris, cracked this simple access system in 30 seconds. The door opened. Luke walked in and the door closed. This room was different from the other rooms. It was a double suite, and Miss Miller was in a smaller bedroom. He walked over right away, but the door suddenly opened and a shadow rushed out. Her arms swung out and she charged at him. Surprised, Luke cancelled stealth mode. The Big Dipper armor's stealth system came from Tony, and was deliberately different from Batman's stealth system, which was created with the Predator's technology. The most obvious difference was that when stealth mode was cancelled, there was a colored fluctuation as Luke's transparent form quickly turned solid. The black and white skull helmet and the black eye sockets were absolutely low-key. He finally said, "You can see me?" Miss Miller, who was wearing an indifferent expression, was still wearing a black leather jacket, but there were 10 cm long silver blades on her hands. Even stranger, these weren't gloves, but extended right out of her fingertips, and sharp nose detected the faint scent of blood. It was clear they had broken through the skin on her fingertips. There was no blood at the base of the blades, as if the skin had already wrapped around them. While he was observing the other party was also observing him. Her eyes glowed a bright red, which startled Luke. A Terminator? Then, he felt that he was overthinking it. Although this woman was wearing leather, and had red eyes and finger blades, she could be considered an old acquaintance, and her leather jacket wasn't dark red. Terminator or whatever, he was just overthinking it. The other party remained vigilant and didn't move. Luke didn't want to wait any longer. Although running into this woman was a pleasant surprise, there was no need to waste time. He charged at Miller. Miller's eyes glowed red, and she slashed at Luke with both hands like a whirlwind. Suddenly, she froze. It was a short but fatal pause. When Luke had spoken earlier, the effect of elementary pheromone control had been multiplied. The moment she froze, Luke's left fist broke through the finger blades and hammered down on her head. Duong. There was a slightly muffled metallic sound, and Miller staggered 2 steps, but her mind seemed to clear up a little, and she tried to retreat. Surprised, Luke flexed his fist and exclaimed, "What a hardhead." As he spoke, he followed up with his right fist. Duong. Duong. Miller, who had just regained her balance, was punched twice again in the head. This time, she finally couldn't take it anymore, and she fell backward onto the floor with a bang. Luke's expression changed. Why did she sound like a fatty who weighed hundreds of kilograms? She hadn't been that heavy the last time he saw her. He crouched down and flicked the woman's forehead with a finger. The skin on her forehead caved a little, and there was another metallic echo. Unexpectedly, this woman had a literal hard head. Her skull was actually all metal, and very hard at that. It was truly amazing. The system notification popped up. System, defeat Alice Miller. Mission accomplished. Total experience, 100. Total credit, 100. Contribution rate, 100%. EXP plus 100. Credit plus 100. Luke was stunned. So little. Looking at the system interface, he saw that Alice Miller was only a light red evil. He felt a little pained. Had he hit the wrong person? But the arrow was already knocked, and he had to let it fly. Now was not the time to think about this problem. Luke pressed down on her head and, with a thought, put Alice Miller into space 2. Activate hibernate function, he ordered. Almost instantly, he received feedback from the system. System, living organism hibernation January 1st. Time limit, 30 days. Cost, 20 credit points a day. He only pondered this notification for a moment before he gave up. Now wasn't a good time to test this hibernate function. The most important thing was to complete his objective. Luke cursed inwardly. The 4 auxiliary wings on his back popped out, and the jet spurted bright white flames. With a whoosh, the Big Dipper armor sped up and charged into the tunnel. Clinks rang out as the metal armor brushed against the cement walls. Even the rushing water behind Luke couldn't drown out the sound. The Big Dipper armor used all its tricks as it shot around corners. At the final turn, to avoid slowing down, Luke braced himself and performed the ultimate technique. The Big Dipper armor swung around the corner on the metal piping that ran along the wall in what amounted to a leg split in the air. He dashed forward, regardless of how his crotch felt. He wouldn't die, he would never be killed by something small like this, but if he got trapped under the base, who knew when he would be able to extricate himself from it? His time was very valuable, and he certainly didn't want to waste it. Thankfully, he was on top of things, and was escaping a little faster than the rate at which the base was being destroyed. The Big Dipper armor reached the end of the escape tunnel in 7 to 8 seconds, where there was a metal door. Open! Luke roared as he raised his fists in the classic Superman flying pose and charged forward. Duong! Even with Luke's sturdy physique, it was a little unbearable. There were actually multiple layers to this door, and the Big Dipper armor wasn't the most powerful armor. It actually couldn't instantly break through the final obstacle, and Luke got stuck halfway. Struggling to pull himself free, Luke looked at the rolling water behind him and the tunnel that was swiftly crumbling. The funeral BGM for tonight was still in his ears. Walking through the city streets, is it by mistake or design? Pained, Luke could only curse, Motherf dash. Rumble. Boom. 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 The Big Dipper armor was buried under the collapsed base. 10 minutes later, a transparent shadow broke out of the lake. Depressed, Luke looked at the information from the drone on the virtual screen. Polaris was already reporting, the medium-sized drone didn't detect anything. There is no sign of anyone else escaping the base. After a brief silence, Luke sighed. I'm sorry. I tried my best. He apologized to the innocent superhumans in the base. There weren't many of them. Even if the base hadn't self-destructed, they might not necessarily have been able to live for long, but in the end, they still died. Although Luke had lost the chance to obtain more abilities because of this, he didn't want to think of it that way. There would always be a chance to collect abilities, but Luke felt that it was better to maintain basic respect for the lives of innocent people. Stephanie's clear and crisp voice was still in his ear. Choose your last words, this is the last time, 'cause you and I, we were born to die. Lowering his head, he observed a moment of silence for the innocent. The Big Dipper armor cruised southwest at low power, and arrived at Anvil Island half an hour later. Luke flew slowly in close to the surface of the ocean. He tossed the garbage that was in his inventory one after another into the ocean. He had collected a lot of these things recently, and had yet to throw them away. This could be considered the end of his mission. After disposing of the trash, he flew to Vancouver in the south. Switching to a new alias, he entered Vancouver International Airport. After buying a flight ticket back to New York for 6 in the morning, he sat down in a quiet corner of the VIP lounge. He then put on his sunglasses and reviewed the cleanup operation on the virtual screen. When he came, he naturally used a fake alias, which was abandoned forever after touching down in Vancouver. Likewise, the identity he was using to go back to New York would no longer appear again after this. It didn't matter if the Big Dipper armor was exposed on this operation. This alias, which wasn't afraid of using any sort of ability, was destined to participate in all sorts of matters related to superpowers. It would also kill countless criminals with superpowers or people who wanted to use superpowers to commit crimes. To be blunt, Big Dipper was certain to be the biggest fall guy among his numerous aliases. If this alias provoked too much trouble, then, he would switch to another set of armor and nickname. In any case, he was too used to this sort of thing. He quickly finished his review of the operation this time. He then took stock of the gains. First of all, he had rescued Alice Miller and Carrie Miller, which wasn't too much of a surprise. According to intelligence he had gathered, it had indeed been possible that the mother and daughter were in the hands of Sentinel services. Although it was a less than 20% chance, it was already very high. That was also why he had prioritized eliminating Sentinel services. Next were the guards, which the system had already paid out for. 147 individuals gave him a total of 47,000 experience and credit points, with each person worth over 300 points. When he emerged from the bottom of the lake, the system gave him the remaining notification. System: eliminate the Sentinel services guards and destroy the secret research base. Mission accomplished. Total experience, 50,000. Total credit, 50,000. Contribution rate, 100%. EXP plus 50,000. Credit plus 50,000. Hosts experience, 193,500/500,000. Credit, 489,500. Luke's expression was odd. So, the destruction of the base was still credited to him. Based on his past experiences, the system only deemed him to have contributed based on his direct actions during a mission. For example, he hadn't earned any experience or credit for issuing an earthquake warning through Professor Lawrence Hayes. Even if the system didn't acknowledge the TV program, there had still been dozens of staff members in the studio when Professor Lawrence shared the news. However, the system didn't give them any experience and credit points for preventing earthquake casualties. Thus, if the dam base's self-destruct mechanism was a light switch, the system wouldn't consider Luke to have contributed anything if Luke had gotten someone else to flip the switch. If he told Selena to go out and beat up hooligans, the experience and credit points would go only to Selena, and not him. However, the system credited him with the destruction of the secret base, which meant that he had personally flipped the switch. Thinking that, he felt a little embarrassed. Was he just fooling himself? Puzzled, various data scrolled over his lenses, and after a simple filtering of certain factors, he finally found 2 suspicious points. When the base's self-destruct mechanism was activated by an unknown signal source, it was exactly 5 minutes after he put Alice Miller into Space 2. And when the base self-destructed, it was 5 minutes after it was activated. Not 1 second more, not 1 second less. It was clear that the 5 minutes between activation and destruction was to give time for the person in charge to evacuate. So, there was probably a connection between Alice being put into Space 2 and the self-destruct mechanism. Upon discovering this, Luke couldn't help but focus on Alice Miller, who was hibernating in Space 2. On the way back to Vancouver, he did some tests on Alice in Space 2. Before, Space 1 could detect the internal structure of equipment, which could be assembled and dismantled in the space. After Space 2 appeared, it could store living things, but they couldn't be examined, dismantled, or put together. Like the inventory before it was modified, Space 2 could only sense the basic state of living things inside it, like who was inside, whether they were awake or unconscious, and so on. It wasn't until the system used the Hand's stone coffin to modify the inventory that this hibernate function appeared for Space 2. Not only that, when Luke wanted to take a look at the two people in Space 2 earlier, he got the feeling that he could examine them. At that moment, his mind was using a method that felt unfamiliar yet natural to him to look at Alice Miller. It was hard to describe the feeling, but it was similar to a person seeing an X-ray for the first time. In Space 2, it was as if everything about Alice was transparent to him, including the metal bones throughout her body. The head that he had hit 3 times in a row was real metal, and wasn't bent out of shape at all. Also, the electronic chip here had been implanted very ingeniously. It was actually connected to her irises and her brain. Wait, an electronic chip. Luke abruptly sobered up. There was an electronic chip inside Alice. Almost instantly, he remembered the 50,000 experience and credit points which the system had given him. Was it because of this electronic chip? Electronic chip implants weren't rare. They were used in low-end artificial organs. Even a certain tycoon still had to rely on them to control his armor. Of course, Luke was also using this technology of Tony's. Otherwise, if the smart program couldn't detect vision, conduits, movements and so on, the armor wouldn't be very agile. Without electronic chips, Luke would only be able to create a fully manual armor like the first-generation Batman suit. He had to rely on his own physical movements, and the armor couldn't provide any assistance at all. The electronic chip in Alice happened to be in between the two types. It was an advanced product produced by some lab, and was much more powerful than the weak chips produced for artificial organs. It absolutely wasn't a mass-produced product. This was something Luke could guarantee with the knowledge he obtained from Tony Stark. But it was also far inferior to the top-notch chips which the Tycoon used to control his armor, as there was no sense of craftsmanship. It was precise and rigorous, but there was nothing aesthetic about it. It was very stable, and could only at most be considered to meet the required standard. Perhaps that was how the head of Sentinel Services treated Alice. She was just a tool. In less than 2 years, Alice had turned from a female executive into a killing tool. She was working for Sentinel Services, which was actually holding her daughter captive. It would be strange if she was willing. When Rumford was hit by the fog back then, all the scared residents didn't dare leave the supermarket, and Luke and Selina didn't want to take any risks as well. Alice, however, had been willing to risk her life for her daughter. In the end, she persuaded Luke and Selina to go with her to rescue Carrie. How could a mother who would risk her life for her daughter watch her be locked up to become a test subject? From her metal skeleton and the electronic chip connected to her brain and eyes, the answer was obvious. Also, if the activation of the self-destruct mechanism was related to this chip, Luke could guess the purpose behind this design. If Alice was trapped, she would have plenty of time to decide whether or not to activate the self-destruct sequence. That was because she had intermediate self-healing. It was precisely because Luke knew that Alice had a self-healing ability, and out of a perverse sort of curiosity, that he specially used a sky hammer technique to jolt her brain and make her lose consciousness. But if he didn't have Space 2, Alice would have come back to her senses and started fighting him again. When she realized that she couldn't overpower Luke, she would have activated the self-destruct mechanism. As for Alice's opponents, they could only kill her or get out of the base. The last safeguard for the self-destruct mechanism was probably the signal from the electronic chip in Alice's head. 5 minutes after it disappeared, the self-destruct mechanism would be automatically activated. It would be very hard for anyone else to get anything out of the base in 5 minutes. Certainly not the witnesses, who were the most important of all. Any research material would likewise probably also be destroyed. Wait. Wait a minute. Luke suddenly felt a strange sense of déjà vu. A familiar, magnetic male voice floated through his head. If man and device are separated for more than 10 seconds, the device will automatically explode. Alice had been separated from the device, no, from the base for hundreds of seconds. No wonder the base exploded. F***CKU. How dare you steal a future security idea for the titanium phone? You're courting death. Luke couldn't help but curse. Cursing was one thing, but Luke had to admit that for someone who didn't know anything, it would be very hard to get a lot of things out of the secret base. If he didn't have a cheat, he definitely wouldn't have gotten even a single strand of hair today, and would have been buried underwater. Thinking that, he couldn't help but feel respect for the head of Sentinel Services. D***MN, you have some nice tricks. Because of this, Luke felt that as long as he found traces of this person, he had to hurry over and see him off on one final journey. It was best for God to look over this genius himself as soon as possible. After noting down the project head in his black notebook, Luke continued tallying his gains. After defeating Alice, his abilities were refreshed with her intermediate self-healing ability. As someone devoted to safety as number one, this ability was absolutely a top priority for him. Elementary self-healing was a godly life-saving skill, but he barely used it in this respect. Instead, it was very effective for when he was up the whole night working. The more he hid this life-saving trump card, the more he would be able to turn things around at a critical moment. This ability alone was worth a year of hunting down Sentinel Services, even if the prerequisites were 80 strength and 100,000 credit points, and it was temporarily unavailable. And this was just the least of his gains from this cleanup operation. The second valuable gain was from Stu Cooper. System, you have killed Stu Cooper. You may learn some of his abilities. Stu Cooper's abilities: elementary cloning, partially available. Prerequisites: 20 strength, 20 dexterity, 20 mental strength. Special mental ability. Credit. This Stu Cooper whose head Luke had blown up the moment they met was simply a pleasant surprise. A year ago, Stu, who had still been in high school, went on a murder spree in Woodsburg with his good friend Billy Loomis. The victims included Deputy Director Condra's niece, so Luke and Selena had been given the assignment. At that time, Stu had used his cloning ability to create an alibi for himself. He had been very successful at pretending to be innocent, but Luke had caught him with sharp nose. In the end, Stu failed to kill his girlfriend, and he simply killed his partner, Billy. Luke stopped him just as he was about to kill Billy's girlfriend, but Stu used his cloning ability to slip away again. The guy left a deep impression on Luke. He was the only high school student Luke had ever encountered with such a savage nature and bizarre thinking, as well as such an unusual ability. But the world was unpredictable. This deranged and ruthless guy had escaped from Luke back then, but had been caught by the even more ruthless and inhumane Sentinel Services and turned into a test subject. Luke didn't know if this was karma or just bad luck. In the end, the cloning technique which Luke had hypothesized back then had still fallen into his hands. Before boarding his return flight, Luke had actually been using sheer willpower to calm down and stop his thoughts from running wild. Except for when he received Carol's gratitude at the very beginning and obtained the right to learn elementary self-healing, it had been a long time since he had been this excited. That was because he thought that the system would determine that he couldn't learn something like cloning. In the end, a cloning ability suddenly appeared, and it actually didn't have the customary, unavailable, tag, but was, partially available. It was a good thing Luke had left the job of cruising at a low speed to Polaris at the time, or he really would have fallen from the sky. Had Daddy's system really gone crazy this time? It actually gave him a magic-type skill. The thought flashed through Luke's mind, but he immediately dismissed it and continued to prostrate himself before the system. It was rare for the system to suddenly go CRA. No, it was benevolence. It was definitely a sudden outpouring of benevolence, which allowed him to unlock a true magic ability. Even though there were question marks for the special mental ability and credit prerequisites, he was still grateful from the bottom of his heart. If he could really learn this ability, he would be fine if he couldn't learn any other magic abilities for the rest of his life. In any case, that was up to the system. These two abilities alone as his gains from this operation made Luke feel that the world was too beautiful. For a rare moment, his mind wandered and he was lost in a fanciful dream. At noon the next day, Luke arrived at the airport. After changing his appearance, he went straight to the New Hope Research Center in Nassau County. In the lab, he sent Selena an anonymous message which just said, "I'm back." Selena simply replied that she got it, and didn't say anything else. They would continue acting as usual until Luke returned home. Otherwise, they would be exposed if Luke popped out from here right after Selena went out for a spin with his face. In any case, they were used to going out on their own to earn points, there was no need for them to hurry and meet. Luke looked in on John Wick in passing in the dark room, and they exchanged a few polite words. John led a peaceful life. Although he stayed inside, he had some training equipment and a square-headed dog to keep him company. There were a lot of things on the computer which Luke had provided him. From publicly available information to TV dramas and movies, there was enough for a person to lie there and look at forever. It wasn't too hard nowadays for a man to hole up at home. Luke then entered the workshop. After activating the workshop's maximum defenses, he put on the Big Dipper armor and placed Alice on the workbench. His eyes were bright as he looked at Alice. He released Osiris from Space One, and the medical robotic arms and equipment started working on the person lying on the workbench. In less than 20 minutes, the electronic chip connected to Alice's brain and eyes was taken out and stored in a special box in Space One. It was very likely that the chip had a GPS function, and he couldn't give the signal a chance to leak out. He was very interested in this chip. The technology was one thing, but he might be able to use it to find other superhumans. After taking out the chip, he had Osiris do a full-body checkup of Alice and collect first-hand data and back it up before he put Osiris back into Space One. The medical AI had medical data related to superhumans. Luke couldn't be any more careful with it. At that moment, there were no longer any electronic tracking devices on Alice, and her fingertips were clean. In that short moment, the sedative she had been injected with for the surgery was no longer effective, and her wounds healed completely. The woman suddenly opened her eyes and shouted, "Carrie." She sat up. A moment later, she turned around in confusion and tried to figure out what this completely unfamiliar environment was. Then, she saw a person. He was standing quietly not far away. The man wore black and white armor. The left side of his skull-like helmet was white, and the right side was black. The black eye sockets were very strange. "Hello, Alice. So you remember you have a daughter?" asked Luke. Alice was initially shocked, but she was at a loss when she heard that. "What are you talking about? Where am I?" Looking at her face, Luke fully activated elementary pheromone control. "Don't you remember your daughter, Carrie?" Alice's expression changed. Carrie, who's Carrie?" "Luke." A long few hours later, he finally finished communicating with Alice. Luke shook his head helplessly as he looked at Alice, who was wearing a big t-shirt and shorts and staring blankly at the cup of hot cocoa she was holding. Like in the movies, Alice had lost her memory. Unlike the movies, Luke had most of the information on her before she went missing. Her memory loss wasn't from being struck in the head, like in a romance story, but followed the more typical superhero plot. The intense mental stimulation had caused her brain to seal itself off so that she forgot the painful memories. Now, Alice could only remember her time at Sentinel Services. For someone like her who had a self-healing ability, it could only be a mental issue. She would recover from simple brain damage in a matter of minutes. Otherwise, Luke wouldn't have dared take out the electronic chip from her head so soon. But the information he had on hand was enough. She could slowly look through the information to retrieve her past, but it wasn't a problem if she didn't. The only problem was that she forgot that she had a daughter, and only remembered the name, Carrie. Alice lost control of her emotions several times during the questioning, and it took her a while to calm down. Luke could only be glad that he hadn't learned elementary pheromone control and basic hypnosis for nothing. He had to use both at the same time to prevent her from smashing up his workshop. A few hours later, Alice, who had calmed down, sat on the side in a daze, and Luke began to analyze the information he had just obtained. He had obtained a lot of information from Alice, but none related to technology. Scientific research wasn't something a person could remember purely from memory. The research data generated by Sentinel Services, a project which involved research on humans, could probably fill an entire room. The most important piece of intelligence was the information of the person in charge of the Sentinel Services project. William Stryker was supposedly a high-ranking person in the American Army, and it was still a mystery which division he belonged to. But he had been going back and forth between the base and DC for a long time, and was definitely connected to the American government. This was a good thing to know. With the multifaceted system, all Luke needed was a direction in which to investigate. No matter how cautious the man was, he would leave traces behind as he went in and out of DC. Luke would find his trail sooner or later. Thinking that, he pushed in a medical gurney from outside and told Alice to get some rest first. Still in a daze, Alice nodded and lay down. She didn't move after that, but her eyes twitched under her closed eyelids. She clearly wasn't asleep. Luke ignored her. The mother had been sorted out, but the daughter was still in space too. After Luke let Alice out, Carrie also entered the hibernation state. Only then did Luke use his mental senses to perceive her physical condition. In the end, Carrie also had an electronic chip in her body. Thankfully, it wasn't in her brain, but under the skin on her back. He opened another workshop and activated maximum defenses. He quickly took out the chip, and also sealed it away in Space One. After everything was done, he didn't wake Carrie up, but put her in Space Two again before he went next door. "Alice, take a nap. I'll take you to a safe place," he said to the woman on the bed. Alice's eyelids twitched, but she didn't open them. Luke injected an excessive dose of the sedative into her neck. 10 seconds later, he tried putting Alice away, and she disappeared. He was relieved. Alice's ability to recover was too strong. It took more than 10 seconds for the powerful sedative to take effect, and she would regain consciousness again in 20 seconds at most. She wouldn't be able to enter Space 2 then. Thankfully, the hibernate function in Space 2 didn't work like a sedative, and she wouldn't suddenly wake up once she was inside. Luke took out the Thousand Faces system and started setting up masks and fingerprints. Their identities were too sensitive and they absolutely couldn't show their faces. If he hadn't created the Thousand Faces system, he would have considered sending them to a sparsely populated state or even another country. Now, all he needed to do was change their identities and appearances. 10 minutes later, he completed 2 sets of the Thousand Faces masks and left the lab. 40 minutes later, Luke let Alice and her daughter out in a quiet bungalow on the northwest side of North Bergen, New Jersey. 10 seconds later, Alice opened her eyes. She wasn't surprised to see Luke still in his armor. She subconsciously looked at the couch not far away. A tiny figure was lying on it with her arms crossed. Alice's heart trembled. "Is she dead?" Luke said, "No, she just likes to sleep in that position." Alice was bewildered, but she had already stood up. Taking 2 steps, she slowly knelt down next to the couch and looked at that face that was yet unfamiliar to her. Scattered images flashed through her mind, and the little girl's face appeared. Alice murmured in a shaky voice, "Carrie." Luke said, "It'll take her a few minutes to." He swallowed his words when he saw a person who looked exactly like the girl on the couch standing next to Alice. Sensing something, Alice turned around. Carrie, who had just appeared, reached out to gently wipe the tears from Alice's eyes. But that small hand was like a mirage as it brushed past Alice's face, unable to wipe away the tears. The little girl didn't care. She continued trying to wipe the tears as she called out, "Mom, you're finally back." Eyes flashing, Alice reached out to hug Carrie, but her hands also only met air. She couldn't help but say in a shaky voice, "No, don't go." Luke coughed and said, "That's just Carrie's projection. Her body hasn't woken up yet." It wasn't like he wanted to watch this melodrama, but he couldn't leave right now, so he could only interrupt. Alice, however, didn't seem to hear him. She still tried to hug Carrie, who seemed real but couldn't be touched. Luke could only step forward and inject Carrie with a bit of something to wake her up. A moment later, the Carrie standing next to the couch suddenly disappeared, and the Carrie on the couch opened her eyes. He caught Alice's attention. "Carrie's awake. She's on the couch." Seeing Carrie disappear, Alice had been about to yell, but she couldn't help but turn around. Carrie stretched out her hand again to touch her mother's cheek. This time, she was able to wipe Alice's tears away. "Mom, I'm back. We'll be together forever." Alice cried again and hugged Carrie. Luke ruined the mood once again as he warned, "Wait." Alice paused, then heard the rest of his words. "You have to be very gentle, with your current strength, you could break Carrie in half." Hearing that, Alice froze and didn't dare continue. Carrie, however, sat up and wrapped her arms around her neck. "It's fine, Mom. We're both fine. System, you have received Carrie Miller's appreciation. You may now learn some of her abilities." Carrie Miller's abilities: elementary telekinesis, elementary spirit form, special mental class, partially available. Prerequisites: 40 mental strength. Credit. Luke was stumped. After hesitating for a moment, he ultimately didn't choose to immediately learn Carrie's ability. Patience was a virtue. Besides, Alice was holding Carrie right now. If she lost control of her emotions and literally hugged her daughter to death, it would be the greatest tragedy in the world. It wasn't until 5 in the morning that Luke left the bungalow. After he came out, he turned around and looked at the bungalow, and the faint regret he felt over this operation finally vanished. Although it was a little unfair to the other superhumans who had been buried under the ruins of the secret base, it was already a miracle that he could save this mother and daughter. He had a deep connection with them. In the beginning, they escaped together from Rumford. Then, he rescued Carrie from Mephisto and promised to rescue her mother, Alice. In the end, he earned both their gratitude. Alice's intermediate self-healing was a first-rate life-saving ability. Given this ability, Luke had to do his best to make life as easy for the mother and daughter as possible. As for Carrie's elementary spirit form, it was a special mental class. The last special mental ability which Luke acquired was Mr. Smith's elementary penetration. Elementary annihilation, which was created with elementary penetration, was his strongest trump card. He wouldn't underestimate any special mental ability. He might be able to develop another trump card. While he had planned to give them the Thousand Faces masks, he ultimately decided to postpone it. The mother and daughter had just escaped, and needed to familiarize themselves with each other again. Replacing their faces now wouldn't help them recover. The Thousand Faces system also involved the 3+2 teams at the record company, and absolutely couldn't be leaked. He didn't trust Alice for real. This woman had been under William Stryker's control before, and Luke wouldn't bet that it wouldn't happen again. Thus, the mother and daughter could only live in the basement of the bungalow. But they had each other, as well as the internet and TV as diversions, so they probably wouldn't care. In passing, he had put enough food in the house. He would come take a look at them every night until they could leave. Thinking that, he jumped into the air. What Luke didn't know was that he would become even more entangled with the mother and daughter in the future, and he would be fine with it. When he got home, he started making breakfast. There had been gains and losses with this cleanup of Sentinel services. His mood was unsettled, and he needed to cook to calm down. The dog head, whose sense of smell wasn't any worse than Luke's, smelled the food and immediately ran over to watch intently outside the kitchen. Seeing that Luke wasn't going to feed it while he cooked, the dog head decisively took out a tablet and lay down outside the kitchen to continue watching its show, but the aroma of food distracted it every now and then. But it could resist this temptation. At 6 in the morning, Selina got up and went downstairs. She raised an eyebrow when she saw Luke and the dog laying out breakfast. Good mood? Luke moved the huge steamer basket that was on top of the dog's head to the table. He said with a smile, "It's all right. Let's eat first." Selina didn't raise her head as she ate the prawn dumplings, soup dumplings, siumai, and rice flour rolls. "Seems like you're not in a good mood." Luke was amused. "You get good food whether or not my mood is good. Don't think too much, or you'll lose the mood to eat." Selina stuffed another siumai into her mouth. "Really? I can pretend you're Elsa or Elizabeth. I guarantee I'll quietly listen to you rant." Luke rolled his eyes. "Why are you copying them? Last time, the three of you got drunk and went crazy. You scared Gold Nugget next door so much it almost cried." Busy chewing, the dog head looked up blankly. "Huh. But nobody paid attention to it." Selina snorted. "You're exaggerating." Luke took a sip of his soybean milk. That time, Elsa hugged the punching bag, then suddenly punched it and shouted, "I'll kill you. I'll kill you." Selina was stunned. How did you know? Were you eavesdropping?" Luke chuckled and glanced at the dog head that was still busy eating. Selina was enlightened, but she still refused to admit it. "Then you should empathize with Elsa. She's already so old. This Iron Lady wasn't some 80-year-old grandma. She was still very lively." Disagreeing inwardly, Luke switched to the other subject. Elizabeth was even more bizarre. She said that her combat skills had improved a lot, and she insisted on demonstrating it to the two of you, and did a split in the air. In the end, she couldn't cross her legs in the morning. Selina sweated and didn't know what to say. The after effects of that air split were too painful after Elizabeth woke up the next morning. At that time, while Selina comforted her, she was secretly glad that there had been a thick carpet on the floor, or it wouldn't just be the top of her thighs that Elizabeth would be clutching in the morning. After a long awkward moment, she suddenly recalled, "What were we talking about?" She then realized that Luke didn't want to tell her the details of the operation, so he had deliberately changed the subject. She stopped asking. Selina knew very well that she couldn't compare with Luke. They had worked together for more than a year, but he experienced far more than she did, and had never been one to be so transparent with his emotions. If it wasn't for the fact that they had known each other for a long time, and Luke rarely took pains to hide things from her, she actually might not have sensed anything wrong. He didn't want to say it because he was afraid that she wouldn't be able to take it. After breakfast, Luke and Selina reported to the police department like normal and followed up on the 2 cases they had taken earlier. They slipped home at 3 in the afternoon, and Luke went to the basement. Sitting down, he finally began to study Carrie's abilities. He directly learned elementary telekinesis, which was a small matter of 2,000 credit points. Then came the highlight, elementary spirit form. A system notification popped up. System, this ability cannot be learned on its own, and needs to be linked to another ability to activate the system's internal ability, Star of Justice. Link? Luke's eyes widened. WTF. What the hell was this internal ability? What the hell was the Star of Justice? But his mind had already automatically made the decision, link. System, special mental ability elementary spirit form is now linked to elementary cloning. Activate the system's internal ability, Star of Justice. Instead of activating it immediately, Luke had a quick look at elementary cloning. Now, the prerequisites for elementary cloning were, 20 strength, 20 dexterity, 20 mental strength, elementary spirit form and credit points. The prerequisites for elementary spirit form were 40 mental strength and credit points. After seeing the notes for these two abilities, Luke pondered for a moment, and finally told the system, activate. The system released another notification, minimum requirements to activate the system's internal ability, Star of Justice, 20 strength, 20 dexterity, 20 mental strength, 100,000 credit. Host meets the requirements. Activating Star of Justice. The credit points in the system were instantly reduced by 100,000, and the ability, Star of Justice, appeared in Luke's list of abilities. Then, a dumbfounded Luke stared at, and equally dumbfounded, him, in front of him. After staring blankly for a moment, he couldn't help but shout, WTF. System, what the hell is going on? All this time, he used credit points to purchase abilities from the system, and it was up to him when to use them. But when he looked at him in front of him, the system actually gave him an explanation, Star of Justice Level 1. Basic stats, 10 strength, 10 dexterity, 10 mental strength. Surprise, Motherf ** Cur, X2, both Lukes couldn't help mumbling the words at the same time. It wasn't until a good while later that Luke figured out the functions and origin of this internal ability. The so-called Star of Justice was actually just like some Bane of Evil or superhero, it was just a term to indicate what side it stood for. In fact, it was a cloning ability. It was just that it was a combination of elementary cloning and elementary spirit form. In fact, everything was as Luke had guessed. All his abilities were normal changes brought about by an increase in his physical and mental strength, they couldn't be created out of thin air. This was also the reason why many of the abilities he learned had stat prerequisites. But the Star of Justice's cloning ability was different from other abilities. It didn't belong to him, and had to be activated by the system. Also, after activating this ability, the Star of Justice clone had appeared, and couldn't be cancelled. Of course, there was a recall function which could make the clone completely disappear, but activating it again required another 100,000 credit points. Apart from that, the clone would only disappear on its own if it suffered a destructive blow or there weren't enough credit points. That was right, maintaining this clone required credit points. The system had already indicated that as long as the clone existed, 100 credit points would automatically be deducted every day, even if it wasn't doing anything. In an intense battle, the credit consumption would also increase. To put it simply, credit points were the arc reactor for the clone. Looking at the 387,500 credit points in the system, Luke felt that he probably didn't have to worry about blowing up his clone with overuse in the short term. More importantly, this was about credit points. Geez. Although this Star of Justice should be the lowest level 1 clone and had the most basic stats of 10, it was still one with Luke. For Luke, the Star of Justice was still a part of his body, and was no different from his limbs or body. It was impossible for his clone to be self-aware, like in the movies. This was because Luke was the brain that gave rise to awareness. His clone obtaining awareness was as nonsensical as an ordinary person cutting off their hand, and the hand turning into a person. The Star of Justice did whatever he did. Controlling his own body and what his clone did made no difference to the system. By the same logic, the Star of Justice could also earn experience and credit points, just like Luke himself. In other words, not only could it earn back the points it consumed, it could also provide Luke with experience. So, what did the Star of Justice mean to Luke? It meant that like Batman, v. Boogeyman John, White Wolf, Big Dipper, and so on, it would definitely be the best, Fall Guy. As the thoughts ran through Luke's head, he and his clone were stupefied and didn't move for a long time. Not long after that, Luke came out of the basement and made dinner. After dinner, he indicated that he would join Selena in her combat training to see how she was doing. Selena didn't think much of it. Luke liked to tinker with equipment, then use them to check their physical stats. Gold Nugget and Dollar weren't left out either. The most tests had been done on her. But these tests were also fruitful. In the past few months, her body fat percentage had been increasing steadily, but her physique was getting stronger and stronger, and she was twice as strong as an ordinary person. Unlike most people in the world, what Selena was most afraid of wasn't fat, but that she would wake up one day to find herself muscular all over. Now that her body fat percentage had returned to 19%, she would be happy as long as it didn't fall again. After the combat test was over, everything was more or less the same. Selena continued with her training, and Luke returned to the basement. The moment Luke entered the basement, he exchanged smiles with the second Luke, and they said at the same time, "Looks like it's no problem." The Luke who had gone upstairs for dinner and the combat test was actually the Star of Justice clone, while the real Luke had directed his new body from the basement. The Star of Justice clone was perfectly easy to use and wasn't sluggish at all. The only problem was with Luke's own senses. This body which could move freely had appeared out of thin air. Thanks to how the brain was wired, it was very easy for the real body and the clone to do the same actions. It was like an ordinary person trying to draw a circle with their left hand and a square with their right hand, the two would always overlap. He still needed a period of time to adapt. Luke pondered for a moment, then decided that the Star of Justice clone would be the one to go out in the next few days as a trial run and to see if there was anything unusual about it. Just because Selena couldn't tell the difference didn't mean that other people couldn't. It would only be effective if everyone was fooled. The next few days were as usual. The Star of Justice clone slept, ate and drank. This clone could still eat because it was the same as the real body. Its breathing, body temperature, heartbeat, blood, and DNA were all Luke's. But the energy that was converted from the food it ate instantly vaporized, and only the nutrients required by the human body, such as vitamins, microelements, and minerals, were absorbed. Thus, his clone still needed to eat and drink, just not as much as his real body. Also, every one of its movements consumed energy provided by credit points. Why were credit points energy? This was a very simple question. All this time, learning abilities required credit, expanding the inventory required credit, and finally, even defeating Mephisto required credit. When Luke connected this to how experience points were used to level up, and how stat points were used to improve his physique after he leveled up, the meaning was clear. For his physique to reach an extraordinary level, would relying on the energy from the food he ate be enough? To use food as an analogy, the stat points converted from experience in the system was the main ingredient, which was meat. Leveling up involved eating ordinary food like vegetables and fruits, for a balanced diet, along with water. Luke's conjecture was that it was like the system had given him $10, but had divided it into two beforehand. The first $5, experience, for improving his physique had already been used to make and deliver the purchase, he couldn't change that. The remaining $5, credit, was money he could freely use to purchase abilities and upgrade his inventory. Now, it was as if he had relied on the system to buy a clone cheat. Naturally, to retain this cheat, he had to give the system the $5. Luke, who had already surmised this, wasn't surprised at the deduction for his clone. On the other hand, he was very pleased with the test results. Nobody could tell the difference between the clone and the main body. Nobody felt anything strange when facing the clone. Luke was very confident on this point. If he really had to find fault with this ability, it wasn't that credit was automatically deducted, but that it weakened Luke's abilities. This was Luke's character panel. Host, Luke. Basic character attributes. Strength, 30, plus 10 Star of Justice. Dexterity, 17, plus 10 Star of Justice. Mental Strength, 30, plus 10 Star of Justice. The basic stats for the Star of Justice were all 10. After testing, based on the effects of the stat points alone, this clone was indeed no different from a regular person, and didn't have the systems for X multiplier. In reality, the basic points were taken from Luke himself. After the clone appeared, Luke felt a lot weaker, and there was a fixed decline in his strength. But after testing his body carefully, he realized that this decline wasn't as tragic as he had imagined. That was because the Star of Justice only took 10 stat points, and it didn't affect the actual coefficient. For example, with 40 strength and a coefficient of 4, the actual effect of 40 strength was 40 times 4 is equal to 160, which was 16x a regular person's level. Now that his physical strength had dropped to 30, the actual effect was still 30 times 4 is equal to 120, and not 30 times 2 is equal to 60. It was the same for the other two basic stats. Thus, Luke's physical stats had dropped, but only by a quarter, and not half. Compared with the practicality of the Star of Justice clone, he could absolutely accept this side effect. The truly important thing was that the Star of Justice was a part of him. Thus, it shared all the abilities on Luke's list, including his inventory. This was the most important thing. It was far more important than losing some basic stats. Although the clone's strength, reflexes and speed of thought were only at the level of an ordinary person, with elementary self-healing, it had a lot of options. For example, with limitless physical outburst and elementary muscle control, plus quick reflex and elementary imitation, the effects were multiple times whatever an ordinary person could achieve. With curve shooting, gunfighting, elementary combat proficiency, and high-tech armor, the clone's stats actually weren't that important. For example, the Mullah brothers, the criminals who had hijacked the Montana battleship, the elite assassins of the fraternity, and Nikki, the junior high school student, only had ordinary stats. But the Mullah brothers' quick reflex allowed them to use close-range gunfighting, while Rebecca from the fraternity could jump more than 10 meters with physical outburst. Nikki was twice as strong as an ordinary person, and it clearly wasn't because of her stats. The moment Luke realized this, a thought couldn't help but flash through his mind: maybe Daddy's system knew that this day would come, when Luke decided to become Batman at the very beginning. Was this what it meant for a mortal to be on par with a god? As he studied the Star of Justice clone, Luke's mood couldn't help but improve. He couldn't help it. The benefits of this ability was like an ordinary person striking a lottery worth millions of dollars. It was only because he had immense self-control that he didn't immediately go on a massive cleanup of New York to celebrate his new life. Actually, it would be easy for Selina to detect the abnormalities between the two Lukes, but he wasn't going to tell her. The Star of Justice clone had already claimed the position of super scapegoat. He wouldn't let anyone know that it was his clone. Only that way could the Star of Justice live up to its name and shoulder any blame. In any case, it could be killed and recalled. The energy required to maintain it was credit points, and its death and recall were also just a matter of credit points. However, if it really did die, Luke would have to spend another 100,000 credit points to activate it again. For Luke, this wasn't a small amount, and he couldn't afford to waste it. He wouldn't sacrifice the Star of Justice unless it was absolutely necessary. That was more heartbreaking than burning $1 billion. He wouldn't activate the recall function either unless it was a special situation. After all, if his clone died in front of everybody, it could still help take the responsibility. It wouldn't be easy to gain people's trust if it was recalled. If Luke was destined to lose 100,000 credit points, he would definitely choose the plan with the greatest benefits. Recalling the clone clearly wasn't worth it, and could only be used as a backup plan. A few days later, Luke left all the external work to his clone. Changing his face, he drove a RV to where Alice and her daughter were staying, and stopped 700 to 800 meters away on the side of the road. He then told them they could come out of the basement for now, as long as they didn't leave the house. After all, living in the basement was too much like living at the damn base. If it wasn't for their safety, he really didn't want them to live in the basement. Looking at their current situation, however, they couldn't be considered too unlucky. At least, they had each other now. After obtaining such huge gains, he couldn't act perfunctory with them. This also prevented the two Lukes from being at home at the same time so that Selina and Gold Nugget wouldn't discover the truth. Selina wasn't in the habit of being suspicious of him, but obvious loopholes wouldn't fool her detective intuition. The dog-head sense of smell alone was very troublesome. Luke had relied on his might as the great fiend to intimidate this brainless guy for the past few days. However, there was someone whom he couldn't let continue running free. William Stryker, head of Sentinel Services, was a blood-sucking flea who specialized in hopping from superhuman to superhuman. The destruction of the dam base had been this person's backup plan. Few superhumans had been in the base when it was destroyed. There had been no more than 15 people, including Alice and Stu. For more than 10 years, the superhumans who had been sent to the dam base had basically been turned into test subjects by William Stryker. Except for a few people with unusual abilities, very few of them lived past 2 months. Most of these superhumans' abilities didn't align with William Stryker's research direction. Thus, they were just consumables used for experimental data. Once that bit of value was completely squeezed out, they would completely disappear. This was also one of the reasons why all the guards at the dam had been worth a lot of experience and credit points. Counting the superhumans alone, these guards had taken at least 1,000 lives, not a single one of them was innocent. Indeed, these sorts of cruel and inhuman research methods had produced some results. Alice was probably a test subject. When Luke first met Alice, she didn't have a metal head and blades couldn't pop out of her 10 fingers. Her self-healing ability had also only been at the elementary level. This proved that William had some of the technology. But Luke wasn't interested in William's research results. Even if this technology could only create superhumans in small batches, Alice still wouldn't have been the only superhuman guard at the dam base. Clearly, this technology wasn't mature enough. Either it cost too much, or it was very unstable, or both. But someone as inhuman as William definitely wouldn't let this technology go to waste in his hands. Now that Sentinel Services' only research base was destroyed, this lunatic might act recklessly. Alice said that she had killed many people on William's orders in the last few months. Logically speaking, she should be at least a mid-level red on the system's list of good and evil, but she was just a light red. That was because her actions were controlled by the electronic chip that connected her eyes to her brain. Even if she was unwilling, she would kill when she heard William's order. At the same time, William had set up this electronic chip as one of the detonators for the dam base. Alice's ability and her metal skeleton made her difficult to kill. She could send an alert to William at any time, and he could choose whether or not to blow up the base and destroy the evidence. Whether or not Luke had placed Alice in Space 2 that night, the base was doomed to self-destruct. William would never let evidence from the dam base fall into someone else's hands, including research information that could be used as material evidence and superhumans that could act as witnesses. As long as even a little of it was exposed, he would have to live in the dark forever and could no longer climb to a higher position. Luke felt that William was definitely worth a lot of experience and credit points. He felt that the system would place at least half of the bad things Sentinel Services had done on William's head. So, whether it was to avenge Alice and her daughter and the innocent superhumans who had suffered, or to stop William from continuing to do evil, he had to kill this guy. It just so happened that the multifaceted system had found some leads on William Stryker. The surveillance and number of titanium phone users in DC were among the top in America, and William wasn't very deeply hidden here. Perhaps he thought that with support from the military and some old men in Congress, nobody in America would dare touch him. Then, the star of justice quietly set off. A few days later, William Stryker mysteriously disappeared from DC. This matter caused a stir to some extent before it faded shortly after. William Stryker had too much dirt on him, to the point that nobody dared to casually touch him, though there were very few people who were worried about being implicated. After he went missing, several investigative teams were sent out, but none of them dared to talk about this openly. These people were only concerned about William's research, but wouldn't rush to get involved without a clear goal. After being interrogated repeatedly for a day, William completely disappeared from this world, and Luke received a huge amount of experience and credit points. System: Kill William Stryker, head of Sentinel Services, and the remaining members. Mission accomplished. Total experience, 60,000. Total credit, 60,000. Contribution rate, 100%. EXP plus 60,000. Credit plus 60,000. Hosts experience, 258,500/500,000. Credit, 452,500. By now, more than 90% of Sentinel Services, including the person in charge, had disappeared. The Baldy and his apprehension team from last time also didn't escape this final cleanup. The first thing Luke had done was to use William to give them a secret order to return to DC. When they all went missing, William had yet to be found. When word got out that William was missing, these people were suspected of running away with him. The Star of Justice, who was wrapping things up, didn't return to New York, but went straight to the airport and set off on a trip around the world. Luke, on the other hand, stayed in New York. He didn't spend as much time investigating cases during the day, nor did he go out as much at night. He wasn't good at multitasking yet. Even with sufficient mental strength, he wasn't used to controlling two Lukes at the same time. Letting one Luke rest was an inevitable choice. On the other side, Luke returned to Rio after half a year. After he got off the plane, he headed for Rocinha's slums. Walking along the winding streets with a lollipop in his mouth, he was as relaxed as a tourist. When he entered the narrowest lane, several heads popped out from various buildings around him. A moment later, they turned into 7 or 8 youngsters with guns. Luke chuckled and his eyes flickered with interest as he looked at them over the top of his sunglasses. What a familiar scene. I've missed it. His days in Rio back then had genuinely been good. It would be a lie to say that he didn't miss them. You're not welcome here. Go back the way you came. A young man twirled his gun and raised his head slightly to give Luke an arrogant look. Luke smiled. This is convenient. The young man was stumped, and before he could understand what was going on, the white man was now standing right in front of him, the gun which he had wrested from the young man now aimed at his head. The youngsters around them raised their guns. You're asking for it. Let go of Diego. What are you doing? Thankfully, this bunch wasn't too rash. Otherwise, if one of them pulled the trigger faster than they could think, none of them would survive. Luke said, "Tell the doctor that Puncher wants to meet." The group of youngsters suddenly fell silent. Many of them looked at each other but didn't move. Don't worry, I'm not hostile. Luke smiled and gave the gun back to the young man. I just don't like being threatened. The doctor will understand. At that moment, beads of sweat broke out on the forehead of the young man in front of him, and his voice trembled. Okay, wait. His pistol was loaded, his life had been in the man's hands just now. Now that the danger had been removed for the time being, he felt his legs tremble. But the young man's pride made him unwilling to show any fear in front of his friends. He simply waved his hand behind him. Go tell the doctor that someone's here. Seeing that a kid in the back had yet to stick his head back inside the window, Luke raised his voice and added, remember to say Puncher is here. Only then did he smile and look at a 15 or 16-year-old not far away. Still want candy? The young man wasn't holding a gun, but a book. Seeing the smiling young man with a lollipop in his mouth, a vivid memory surfaced in the teenager's mind, and he couldn't help but cry out, It's you? Luke nodded with a smile and took out a lollipop from his pocket. The young man subconsciously accepted it, but his hands suddenly froze and he trembled. Don't do anything. We're just protecting ourselves. The young men around him looked at him in surprise. Rivaldo, what are you doing? The teenager, Rivaldo, had no time to bother with them. He simply looked at Luke nervously. After Boss Gerard died, I no longer run with gangs, and I'm now going to school. Right, it's the doctor who's teaching us. We're not bad people. Even now, Rivaldo still remembered what the young man had said to him last year: "I love running into bad guys." Then, Boss Gerard and a dozen of his men were killed by this man. Although the young man in front of him had a different face from before, the way he held the lollipop and a calm smile on his face had left a deep impression on Rivaldo. He had woken up in the middle of the night countless times after dreaming of how the young man smiled before opening fire, his expression unchanged after killing someone. He also dreamed of his warning before he left: "If you still want to be a bad guy, you might run into me again one day." Rivaldo knew that he would die if he ran into this young man again. However easily Boss Gerard died, his own death would be even simpler. Many thoughts flashed through his mind, but he could only force a smile. "I haven't run with gangs for a long time." Crossing his arms, Luke looked at the math book in the boy's hand and nodded. "I see. Then, I wish you good luck for the rest of your life." A few minutes later, the kid from earlier stuck his head out again a little further away. The doctor said to bring him over. "Got it." The young man whom Luke had held at gunpoint earlier gestured at him. "Follow me." After Luke disappeared down the path, the youngsters finally relaxed. One of the kids couldn't help but ask, "Rivaldo, do you know this guy?" Various emotions flashed across his face, but he nodded in the end. "Do you remember how Boss Gerard died last year?" The youngsters all drew in sharp breaths. Someone asked, "Did he do it?" With a bitter smile, Rivaldo gestured at the math book in his hand. "Otherwise? Why do you think I suddenly want to study?" "It's because this gentleman broke Boss Gerard's limbs in front of me before shooting him in the head. He then told me that the next time I do anything bad, I'll end up like Boss Gerard." Everybody was stupefied. Huh. They had often joked about Rivaldo, who obediently studied every day. Only now did they know that this guy wasn't really obedient, but had been frightened into obedience. But when they recalled how Luke had pointed his gun at Diego's head, they felt that it was understandable that Rivaldo would be terrified. While they were poor now, there was still hope. If they died, there was nothing. 2 minutes later, Luke was standing in front of a broken metal sheet that passed for a door. Diego, who led the way, simply said, "The doctor's inside," before he quickly slipped away. Luke chuckled and knocked. "Is anyone home?" After a brief silence, a woman said, "Come in." Luke pushed the door open and entered. It wasn't very bright in the room, which was very common in crowded slums. In the dim light, a woman was cleaning a girl's knee. Luke didn't disturb her and simply sat down in a plastic chair. A few minutes later, the woman put down the medical tape in her hands and patted the little girl's head. "Okay, go home. Remember not to let your wound get wet. You can come back tomorrow to change the bandage." The little girl stood up. "Thank you, doctor." The woman hummed in response. As the girl limped off, she glanced at Luke, who was sitting not far away, before she left the room. After the door was shut, the woman quickly cleaned up the medical refuse on the table. Luke looked at her from behind with great interest and couldn't help but mutter to himself, "She's improved a lot. Did she specially train with the Brazilian girls here?" Sensing his intense gaze, the woman paused in tidying up and turned around. "Why are you looking for me? Just tell me what you want." Luke was amused. "It's nothing serious. I just dropped by to tell you that Sloane and all the assassins at number 17 textile mill were killed by someone. You can go back now." The woman was stunned. "What? Are you kidding?" Luke chuckled. "Rebecca, you know I don't like to make jokes." The woman was Rebecca, the redback who had betrayed the fraternity. However, her figure had filled out compared with half a year ago. Clearly, she hadn't seen much action. Hearing that, she couldn't help but roll her eyes. "You tricked me and Mr. X in the bar back then, you big liar." However, the news of the destruction of the fraternity's core shocked her greatly. She quickly calmed down. "I'm doing very well here." Luke thought for a moment and nodded. That's true. As long as you like it, you can live whatever life you want. So, you're not going back to America? Stumped for a moment, Rebecca gritted her teeth and said, "You came looking for me just to say that?" Luke shrugged. "I dropped by to see an old friend." "What's wrong with that?" Looking at his unfamiliar yet somewhat familiar face, she frowned. "You're using this face?" Luke chuckled. "I'm used to it. There are too many strangers here." Rebecca thought about it. Their identities were a little sensitive, so it was understandable that he would come in disguise. "Then, why are you still sitting there?" she asked. Luke got up with a smile. "Okay. Where to?" Rebecca asked. "You don't remember?" Luke chuckled and extended his hand. "Beautiful lady, would you like to have juice with me?" Rebecca finally couldn't hold back anymore and smiled. "Your treat." Luke said, "Of course." The next morning, when they returned to the hut, someone was inside having breakfast. Rebecca smiled. "Riley, we brought breakfast back. Let's eat together." The middle-aged woman put down her sandwich and looked at Luke. "Puncher?" Luke chuckled. "Long time no see, Bloodmint. How have you been?" Rebecca jabbed him with her elbow. "Cut the crap. I told you already, right?" Luke wasn't bothered that she had exposed him. He simply smiled. "Well, I heard that you're doing well." After a brief hesitation, Riley smiled back. "She's right." They sat down and had breakfast. That afternoon, Luke set off again on his own. Neither Rebecca nor Riley planned to return to America. They chose to stay in Rio. Actually, a group of youngsters had already gathered around them in Rocinha. Of course, they weren't suitors. Rebecca had a small clinic and Riley had opened a small school. So, the group called Rebecca the doctor, and Riley the teacher. Medicine and education were what the slums needed the most. Both women weren't short of money. What they were doing was purely out of interest. Nevertheless, they leaned toward a sense of justice, and still took action on the sly, regardless of Luke's advice from back then. But after Cross reduced the fraternity to a state of paranoia, Luke had then cleaned them up, it wouldn't recover for a long time. Even if it did, the organization might not be in the mood to continue making trouble for them. The two women were safe. Luke was here mainly to deliver life one to them. Without it, they wouldn't be able to eliminate the after effects of curve shooting and physical outburst, and they would experience physical and mental problems sooner or later. The two girls didn't know this, and had used their skills a few times in the past 6 months. Luke had only learned about this from Sloane recently. Naturally, he couldn't let them kill themselves for no reason. Secondly, he deposited a large amount of cash in many private bank safes throughout Rio to fund the two women's future setup. If they wanted to establish themselves among the common people, just the two of them weren't enough, and would draw too much attention. Even if the sheep were protected by lions, the hungry wolves would just think of a way to kill the lions first before they ate the sheep. People still had to rely on themselves. The two women from the fraternity were well aware of this, or they wouldn't be training the youngsters outside. Although they weren't short of money, it wasn't enough to run an operation, unless they became drug dealers, which would go against their initial aspirations. So, they only had a dozen young men under them, the ones who had been guarding the entrance. In fact, they were only guarding against gang members from other areas invading their territory, they were like the community watch here. But as they grew older, they would need income, and it was inevitable that they would join other gangs. Luke used his most common method, the shell company, to help them resolve this problem. A shell security company would be able to accommodate these youngsters. Experience and qualifications weren't a problem as long as there was money. With money in the bag, it was up to the women to decide what kind of security force they wanted to train. In Luke's opinion, it would be best to divide these people into two groups. Some of these youngsters didn't have much ambition, they just wanted to make a steady living to feed themselves, so they could be trained as ordinary security guards. Some who wanted to become guns for hire and make a lot of money would undergo basic training and monitoring before they were sent to another security company. There was a market for South American mercenaries in the world. There were many countries in South America, and the situation here was more chaotic. There was always a lot of demand for mercenaries, and even more of the poor who turned to this line of business for money. This was reality, not a crime. As usual, Rebecca and Riley did all the work, while Luke only gave suggestions and didn't get involved in the details. As for financial support, he didn't want shares, but an external force. Profits meant nothing to him. What was really troublesome was having to do everything himself. Like when he had been investigating Sloane before, if there had been a professional force with more people who could have helped him investigate, it would have just been a matter of money. In any case, he had a lot of illegal cash in his inventory, as well as a lot of real estate and private accounts all around the world, and he couldn't use all of them. Using these illegal assets to pay for the hire of an external force would be killing two birds with one stone. He had no intention of hiding his plan from Rebecca and Riley. Whether they became hired guns or gangsters would make a big difference to the kids. Hired guns could make money and retire. This could be considered a freelance job with some future prospects. In comparison, whether or not gangsters retired, 99.99% of them would be forever poor. Rebecca and Selena weren't pure saints, and simply leaned more toward a sense of justice. They had no objections to his plan. Of course, Rebecca had privately told him that the company was his. At that time, Luke had nodded with a smile and said casually, "You have to work toward legitimizing the company. Don't think about profits for now. In the short term, I'll reinvest the profits toward expanding the company, got it?" Rebecca didn't say anything else. All these years, she had only ever been an assassin. Not only didn't she understand emotions, she also had no business acumen. It was only when Riley said that she could run the company that Rebecca agreed. Of course, she didn't know that when Luke said that he would reinvest the profits toward developing the company, so it would be making a loss for a few years at least, he wasn't just thinking about it in terms of the money. After that, Luke flew to Europe and found Kincaid, who was living in seclusion in the Netherlands with his wife. Looking at that cheap black baldy standing on the porch of a small house, he couldn't help but laugh. The guy was chatting with Sonia, his wife. When he noticed Luke, he was stunned. "Cool bird." He then stood up with a smile and went to greet him. They hugged each other lightly. Walking back to the porch, Luke smiled and gave Sonia a hug as well. She was a Latin American beauty, and much cuter than Kincaid and his bald head. Kincaid was quite unhappy, but his wife was happy. What could he do? Luke let go of Sonia, who was getting rounder every day. He looked at her big belly and shook his head. "You." Sonia rolled her eyes and exchanged a few words with him before she went back inside to make them drinks. Luke lowered his voice and tilted his head at Kincaid. "Your wife is about to give birth. Shouldn't you be the one to go make the tea?" Kincaid snorted. "The doctor said that she needs to exercise a little every day, or it won't be good for the triplets." WTF? Triplets. Luke was shocked and couldn't help cursing. "You're really good." Kincaid said smugly, "Hee, you still have a long way to go, kid." Luke, who rarely admitted defeat ever since the system was activated, conceded. Kincaid was almost 50. He had gotten his wife out of Interpol in July last year. It was only the beginning of March, and triplets would be born in 2 months. How many people could compare with him? More importantly, Luke was still a kid. How could he compare with this old man and produce triplets? By a conservative estimate, he wasn't planning on having children in the next 20 years. In other words, he was still having fun in the first half of his life. There probably wouldn't be a chance for him in this lifetime to compete with Kincaid in having kids. After dinner, Luke said goodbye and left. Kincaid and Luke's private discussion didn't take long, the two of them finished everything in the afternoon. Luke hadn't come looking for Kincaid because he wanted the old man to become active again. The old man's leg had been badly injured last time. He could walk, but it would be very dangerous for him if he got into his old line of business again. Coupled with the fact that he now had a family, the idea of going out to fight and kill again had no appeal. Luke had approached him only because he wanted the old man to gather intelligence from Europe's underground network. It wasn't a dangerous job, and could even become a business operation for him, like starting up a trade investigation company or something. In the end, Europe wasn't America, and the multifaceted system wasn't as useful here, so Luke felt that it was better to have a local tyrant to help him.